"You're fired, Miss Whitmore. Collect your things and be gone before supper." Those 7 words ended everything Eleanor had built in 3 years, and the school board chairman didn't even look up from his desk when he said them. She stood in the Montana cold with 31 cents a carpetbag and a storm building on the horizon that every rancher in the territory had already run from. No family, no room at the inn, no plan. Just one light burning in the distance through the white wall of wind. She walked toward it because walking away meant dying. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The school board's decision had not been sudden. Eleanor Whitmore understood that now, standing on the frozen road outside Harmon's Creek, with the wind tearing at her coat like something that had a personal grudge against her. She understood it the way you understand a bad tooth. You feel it for weeks before it finally breaks, and when it does, the pain is still a shock. 3 weeks ago, Chairman Gerald Holt had called her into his office and told her the school board had received a complaint. A formal complaint, written in careful cursive, on official stationery, signed by 4 names, she recognized as the wealthiest families in Harmon's Creek. Miss Whitmore had been teaching the children of miners and ranch hands to read above their station. That was the phrase, above their station. She had stood in that office and stared at Gerald Holt's round, satisfied face and asked him very carefully, very quietly, what exactly that meant. "It means," he said, folding his hands across his desk, "that the children of working men don't need Shakespeare and Latin grammar. They need arithmetic. They need enough reading to follow instructions. You've been filling their heads with ambitions their families can't support and their futures won't allow. I've been teaching them to think," Eleanor said. That, Gerald Holt replied, is the complaint. She had walked out of his office that afternoon with her position intact, her pride burning, and the absolute certainty that she had 3 weeks left before he found a reason, any reason, to finish the job. She had been right. The reason he found was that she'd allowed a boy named Peter Grady, whose father ran the feed store, to borrow a copy of David Copperfield to read over the weekend. Peter's mother had come to school on Monday morning and announced loudly enough for 2 classrooms to hear that her son had been up until midnight reading and had missed his morning chores, and that this was the influence of a teacher who had no respect for how real families lived. Gerald Holt had his reason. By Thursday, Eleanor was holding a letter of termination and trying to remember if she had enough coins for the stage to Miles City. She did not. And that was how she came to be standing on the open road in the middle of a Montana blizzard with 31 cents and a carpetbag that kept trying to blow out of her hand. Then, the storm had come out of the northwest the way Montana storms always did, fast, without much warning, and with the kind of cold that didn't just chill you, but made you feel like the warmth had been extracted from you surgically, like something your body had been borrowing and was now required to return. Eleanor had left the road to Harmon's Creek 2 hours ago. The stage stop at Miller's Crossing was supposed to have been a way station, a place to get out of the wind and wait for something headed east. But Miller's Crossing had been shuttered, the windows boarded, a notice nailed to the door that said the route had been suspended for the winter season. Suspended for the winter season, in Montana, where winter was half the year. She had stood there reading that notice 3 times, as if rereading it would change what it said. Then she had pulled her coat tighter, picked up her bag, and started walking. She was not a woman who panicked. She had decided that about herself when she was 14 years old, and her father had died of a fever, leaving her mother and 3 younger siblings in a house with a leaking roof and a debt to the bank. She had not panicked then. She had taken stock of what was available and what was required and had done what needed doing. What was available now, her coat, her bag, 31 cents, and the knowledge that there was a ranch somewhere to the southwest. She had heard one of the men at the stage stop mention it before the storm closed in Caldwell Ranch. Biggest operation in the valley, ran cattle and horses, and had more hands than any spread in 3 counties. What was required shelter before her fingers stopped working. She turned southwest and walked. She smelled the horses before she saw the lights. That was the thing about ranches in a blizzard, the animals gave them away. The sharp, warm, particular smell of a working stable cut through the snow in a way that lantern light couldn't, and Eleanor followed it the last quarter-mile through drifts that came up past her knees in places. The gate was iron tall with the letters C and R worked into the metalwork at the top. A ranch hand's lantern hung from the post. Someone had remembered to hang it out, which meant someone inside was still thinking about the world beyond their own walls. Eleanor stood at that gate for a moment. She was not naive. She knew what it looked like, a woman alone in a storm showing up at a stranger's door after dark. She knew the assumptions that would be made. She had spent her adult life carefully constructing a reputation for respectability, and she was about to walk up to a man's house in the middle of the night and ask him for shelter, and there was nothing respectable about the optics of that. She also knew that if she stood here much longer, weighing her reputation against the temperature, she was going to lose feeling in her feet, and then her choice would be made for her. She pushed the gate open and walked up to the door and knocked. The man who opened it was not what she expected. She had formed a vague picture in her mind during the walk, an older man probably. A rancher with a gray beard and a wife behind him, and children, and the comfortable assumption that a woman in distress was someone to be helped in the uncomplicated way that people in small communities generally helped each other. Thomas Caldwell was not that man. He was younger than she'd imagined, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair and the kind of face that had been weathered enough to look like it had made its decisions about the world and wasn't entertaining further arguments. He was broad through the shoulder, still dressed from the day's work, and he looked at her with eyes that were very dark and very direct, and showed no particular surprise at finding a woman on his doorstep in a blizzard. What he did show was something that Eleanor couldn't quite name immediately. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't hostility. It was closer to assessment, the way a man looks at something unexpected and tries to determine, before he does anything else, exactly what he's dealing with. "Miss," he said. Not a greeting, not a question, just an acknowledgement of her existence. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided it would be steady before she knocked. "I was a school teacher at Harmon's Creek. The stage stop at Miller's Crossing is closed for the season, and I have no shelter. I can see you're a man of practical sense, and I won't waste your time with anything except the truth. I need a place out of the storm tonight. I can work for the accommodation. I can cook, clean, or tend to whatever needs tending. I'm asking for shelter, not charity." He looked at her for a long moment, not at her face, at her in total, the snow-crusted coat, the carpet bag, the posture that was rigid with the effort of not shaking the hands that she was pressing against her sides, because she didn't want him to see how badly they were trembling. "You walked from Miller's Crossing," he said. "Yes." "In this?" "Obviously." Something moved behind his eyes. It might have been respect. It might have been something else. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The house was warm. Genuinely, immediately warm in a way that made Eleanor's whole body react before her mind had processed it. She stopped just inside the door and stood there for a moment, not moving, not speaking, just absorbing the heat, the way a plant absorbs water after a drought. "Sit," Thomas Caldwell said, and gestured toward the fireplace. She sat. She put her bag down carefully. It contained everything she owned, and held her hands toward the fire and said nothing for a moment, while the feeling came back into her fingers in that particular unpleasant way. That feeling always came back after extreme cold, like being stung by 100 small needles simultaneously. She was aware of him behind her, aware of the sounds of the house, the creak of the structure in the wind, the distant sound of cattle, something else she couldn't place at first. Small footsteps, above her head. "You have children," she said without turning around. "2 boys," he said. "Daniel's 8, Samuel is 5. They should be asleep." "They're not." A pause. "No, they're not." "No." She turned and looked at him. Then, and he was standing a few feet behind her, watching her with his arms at his sides, and that same measuring expression on his face. "Where is their mother?" she asked. The question was direct to the point of rudeness. She knew that. But she also knew that she was in this man's house, and she needed to understand the situation clearly, and the only way she'd learned to get clear information was to ask clear questions. His jaw tightened slightly. She died 14 months ago. I'm sorry, Eleanor said, and meant it. So am I, he said, and the way he said it told her he was done with that particular subject. She turned back to the fire. I'll be out of your way as soon as the storm breaks. I don't mean to impose beyond necessity. Where are you going? He asked. East. Miles City eventually. I'll find work. Doing what? Teaching. Or something else if teaching isn't available. The board fired you. Yes. For what reason? She turned and looked at him again, and something about his directness, the way he just asked things without preamble or apology, made her answer in kind. For teaching children to think beyond what men like Gerald Holt believe their futures allow. Thomas Caldwell was quiet for a moment. Holt's an idiot, he said. Eleanor blinked. He's been running that school board like his personal territory for 15 years, Thomas continued. Last winter, he blocked the board from hiring a second teacher because the applicant was a man and Holt didn't want the competition for influence. The year before that, he declined a donation of books from the territorial library because he said the selection was inappropriate. He paused. What did he say you did wrong exactly? I let a student borrow a novel. Which novel? David Copperfield. Thomas was quiet for another moment. Then he said, That boy was up until midnight reading it, wasn't he? Eleanor stared at him. How did you? Peter Grady. His father delivers feed here. I heard about it 3 days ago from Frank Grady himself. Frank thought it was funny, said the boy had never read anything voluntarily in his life and couldn't put it down. He paused. Holt got to Martha Grady before Frank could say anything useful. Eleanor stopped. That's exactly what happened. Holt's had it out for you since you started, Thomas said. Teachers who actually teach make him nervous. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. The fire was very warm. Her hands had stopped stinging. How do you know anything about how I teach? She asked. My foreman's youngest daughter is in your school. Was in your school. He corrected himself without any change in expression. He talks about it. Says she went from refusing to open a book to asking for more. He came to me 2 months ago to ask if I knew any way to get you a better salary so you'd stay. Eleanor said nothing. She wasn't sure what she was feeling. Something in her chest that was either the beginning of tears or the beginning of anger, and she was too tired to determine which. I didn't know anyway, Thomas added. The board controls the salary. Yes, she said quietly. They do. She heard the footsteps on the stairs before she saw the child. Small footsteps, careful. The kind that are trying very hard not to be heard and therefore are louder than they'd be if the child were simply walking normally. Eleanor kept her eyes on the fire. Samuel. Thomas's voice was flat. Not unkind, just certain. A small sound, not quite a word, from the direction of the stairs. Come out, Thomas said. The boy who appeared in the firelight was small even for 5, with dark hair like his father, and the roundest, most completely open face Eleanor had ever seen on a child. He was wearing a nightshirt that was slightly too large for him, and he was holding a small carved wooden horse against his chest with both hands, and he was staring at Eleanor with eyes that contained approximately 3 seconds worth of caution before being entirely replaced by curiosity. You're a lady, he announced. I am, Eleanor agreed. Why are you here? The storm. He considered this with the absolute seriousness of a 5-year-old processing new information. Is it very bad? It's very bad. Papa says when it's very bad you stay where there's light. He looked at his father. That's what you told me. Go back to bed, Samuel, Thomas said. But she's... Bed. Samuel looked at Eleanor one more time, a look that managed to convey both complete trust and the confident expectation that she would still be there in the morning, and then padded back up the stairs, wooden horse in hand. Eleanor listened to the small footsteps cross the floor above her head and then go quiet. Your other son didn't come down, she said. Daniel wouldn't. A pause. He's 8. He's decided to be careful about people. Since his mother died, before that even, he was always the watchful one. Thomas walked to the other chair by the fire and sat down, not close, but closer than he'd been standing. Samuel trusts everything. Daniel trusts nothing until it proves itself. Eleanor nodded slowly. She understood both instincts. "Which one are you?" she asked, and then immediately heard how that sounded and said, "I'm sorry, that wasn't Daniel," he said without apparent offense. "I'm entirely Daniel, Jas." He fed her cold biscuits and a pot of beans that had been sitting on the back of the stove. Nothing fancy offered without ceremony and accepted without ceremony. She ate with the focused attention of someone who had not eaten since morning and was not going to waste energy on the social performance of eating like she wasn't hungry. He refilled her coffee without being asked. They sat in a silence that was not entirely comfortable, but was not hostile. Either the silence of two people who have been honest with each other and are not sure what to do with that yet. "The hands' quarters are full," he said eventually. "Storm drove everyone in early. There's a room at the end of the hall." It was the housekeeper's room before Mrs. Macy went east to her daughters. "That's fine," Eleanor said. "It's small." "It's inside," she said. "It's more than fine." He nodded once the way a man nods when a negotiation has been concluded to everyone's satisfaction. "I'll show you in the morning," he said. "You'll want to sleep." "I will," she agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for the shelter and the food." He looked at her across the fire for a moment, that steady measuring look. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I haven't decided what this is yet." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean what this is?" "I mean, I have a situation here," he said, "and you walked into it, and I need to think before I say anything else." He stood and handed her a candle and walked her to the small room at the end of the hall and said good night with the efficiency of a man who had made up his mind to stop talking before he started talking and closed the door. Eleanor stood in the small cold room and listened to the storm howl against the walls and thought about the strange flat certainty in his voice when he said, "I need to think before I say anything else," as if there were something very specific that he was considering saying and was not ready to say yet. She put her bag down. She sat on the edge of the small bed. She was too exhausted to worry about it. She'd find out in the morning what Thomas Caldwell had decided about the nature of this situation. She blew out the candle and lay down fully dressed, except for her boots, and was asleep in approximately 45 seconds. She woke to the sound of an argument. Not a loud argument. The walls were thick and the voices were low, but the specific quality of it was unmistakable. Two voices, one adult, one child, both controlled, both clearly having said the same things several times already. Eleanor lay still for a moment. The storm was still going. Daylight was coming through the gap under the door, gray, uncertain, the kind of daylight that arrives apologetically in the middle of a blizzard and doesn't commit to anything. She got up, fixed her hair, put her boots on, and went out. Thomas Caldwell was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his older son standing across from him with the posture of a boy who is trying very hard to look like he's not upset. Daniel Caldwell was, as advertised, the watchful one. He had his father's coloring, but his face was more open than his father's, or it would have been, Eleanor thought, if he weren't currently working so hard to close it. He was 8 years old, and clearly furious, and just as clearly trying not to show it. He saw Eleanor the moment she came through the door, and every muscle in his body went still. She looked at him steadily. She'd taught enough children to know that looking away was the wrong instinct. Children who were furious and frightened needed to be met, not avoided. "Good morning," she said. He said nothing. "Daniel," Thomas said with a low warning in his voice. "Good morning," Daniel said flatly without looking at her. Thomas met Eleanor's eyes over his son's head. There was something in his expression that was very close to an apology, but hadn't quite made it there. "Sit down," he said to her. "There's coffee." She sat. She accepted the coffee. She waited. Samuel appeared from behind the kitchen door in a rush of nightshirt and bare feet, clearly having been waiting for the sound of her to announce herself. "You stayed," he announced as if this were an unexpected miracle. "I stayed." Eleanor agreed. "I told Daniel you would." He climbed onto the bench beside her without any apparent concern about whether this was appropriate. "He said you'd be gone by morning." "Samuel," Thomas said. "It's true," Samuel said with the clear conscience of a boy who had simply reported facts. Daniel's jaw was tight. He was still standing. He had not sat back down. Eleanor noticed he had risen when she entered the room, and sitting down again would mean accepting her presence, and he was not ready to accept her presence. "You don't have to like me being here," Eleanor said to him directly. He looked at her startled that she'd said it out loud. "This is your home," she continued. "I came in out of a storm, and your father was kind enough to give me shelter. That's all this is, and if it makes you uncomfortable, that's a completely reasonable feeling to have." Daniel stared at her. He had clearly expected to be managed, redirected, or gently scolded. He had not expected to be simply told that his feelings were reasonable. "My mother used to sit there," he said. The words landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Nobody spoke. Eleanor looked down at the chair she was sitting in, and understood immediately and completely not just what he meant, but what it cost him to say it. She stood up, carried her coffee to the opposite side of the table, and sat back down. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Daniel looked at her for a moment longer. Then, without another word, he pulled out his own chair and sat down. Thomas Caldwell was watching all of this. His face was carefully still, but his eyes were doing something Eleanor couldn't entirely read, something that looked under the careful stillness a great deal like pain. After breakfast, which she cooked, because the alternative was watching Thomas burn eggs with the focused determination of a man who had been burning eggs for 14 months and had made his peace with it. Thomas sent the boys to the barn with instructions about the horses, and then he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I need to talk to you." "All right," Eleanor said. She was washing the dishes. She kept washing the dishes. "You said last night you were going east," he said, "to find teaching work." "That's right." "You said you'd find something else if teaching wasn't available." "Also right." "What else can you do?" She dried a plate before she answered. "I can cook, clean, keep accounts. I read and write in 3 languages. I can tend a garden and put up preserves and dress a wound and teach children to read who've been told they can't." She paused. "What I cannot do is rope cattle or break horses if that's what you're working toward." "It's not," he said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him behind her working up to something. "I need a housekeeper," he said. "I've needed one for 14 months. Women don't stay. The isolation is too much, and there's no one for them to talk to and they leave. I've had 3. The last one lasted 6 weeks. Eleanor kept washing. "I understand. And my boys need—" He stopped, started again. "Samuel needs someone consistent, someone who isn't going to leave in 6 weeks. Daniel needs another stop. I don't know exactly what Daniel needs, but he needs something I can't give him because I'm his father. And he's decided he can't show me how much he's hurting without it meaning he's weak, so he doesn't." Eleanor set the last dish on the rack and turned around. Thomas Caldwell was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his eyes telling a story that his voice was trying very hard to stay out of. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "what exactly are you trying to say?" He said it without preamble, without softening, with the absolute directness of a man who has decided that directness is the only honest currency he has left. "I'm saying you need a home, and I need a wife, and I think we might be able to help each other." Eleanor did not move. The fire snapped in the hearth. The wind pressed against the kitchen window. Somewhere outside she could hear Samuel talking to a horse. "You're not serious," she said. "I'm always serious," he said. She looked at him. Really looked at him the way she'd been carefully not looking at him all morning. The dark eyes, the weathered face, the set of a man who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has stopped expecting anyone to help him carry it. "You don't know me," she said. "You've known me for 12 hours. I know you walked 4 miles in a blizzard rather than give up," he said. "I know you moved to a different chair without being asked to and without making it about you. I know you cooked a meal for 2 boys and didn't try to make them like you. I know Holt fired you for teaching children to think." He paused. "I've known men for 20 years I knew less about." Eleanor's hands were very still at her sides. "That's not a proposal," she said. "That's a business arrangement." "Yes," he said immediately without any apology. "It is. You're offering me safety in exchange for labor." "I'm offering you a home in exchange for being present in one," he said, "which is different." "How is it different?" "Because labor you can hire. Presence you can't." His voice shifted just slightly, just enough. "Samuel needs someone who will be there tomorrow, not someone who's working out a week's wages and planning to leave. Daniel needs—" He stopped. "He needs to see that someone can be trusted to stay." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "And you," she said. "What do you need?" He held her gaze without flinching. "I need someone who tells the truth," he said, "even when it's inconvenient, and someone who doesn't need me to perform emotions I don't have." Something shifted in Eleanor's chest, a kind of recognition, uncomfortable and precise. "You're not describing a marriage," she said. "I'm describing a partnership," he said. "Separate rooms, separate lives. A legal arrangement that gives you security and gives my boys consistency. If it becomes something else—" He stopped. "It won't become something else. But I won't make promises about what I don't know." That last sentence was the most honest thing she'd heard in longer than she could remember. Most people, when they were asking you to take a risk, made promises. Thomas Caldwell was telling her he didn't know what would happen, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Eleanor looked at the window. The storm was still fully engaged, white and absolute, the world beyond the glass reduced to nothing. She thought about Miles City, which she'd never been to. She thought about the letter of termination in her carpet bag, which she would have to show to every school board in the territory if she tried to teach again. She thought about 31 cents and the stage stop at Miller's Crossing with its boarded windows. She thought about Daniel Caldwell's face when he said "my mother used to sit there," and the way Samuel had pressed his wooden horse against his chest and looked at her like she was something reliable. "Separate rooms," she said. "Entirely separate," he confirmed. "I continue to manage the household on my own terms. I teach the boys. That's what I'm asking you to do. And if it doesn't work, then we find a solution that's fair to both of us," he said. "I won't leave you worse off than you are now. That's the one promise I'll make." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the storm hammered against the house, and inside, the fire burned steadily. And somewhere in the barn, a 5-year-old boy was having a serious conversation with a horse. And upstairs, an 8-year-old boy who had decided to be careful about people was probably listening to every word being said in this kitchen. She thought about what Thomas had said last night before he'd handed her the candle and walked away. "I haven't decided what this is yet," he'd decided. "I need a day," she said, "to think." "The storm's not going anywhere," he said. "Take 2. He uncrossed his arms, picked up his hat from the peg by the door, and walked out into the weather to tend to whatever a ranch required in the middle of a blizzard. Eleanor stood in the warm kitchen in a stranger's house, listening to the storm, and understood with absolute clarity that she was already in every way that mattered, considering saying yes. She turned back to the window and watched the white nothing beyond the glass, and asked herself the one question she hadn't asked Thomas Caldwell. The one question she needed to answer for herself. Not whether this is reasonable. Not whether this is safe. Whether you can do this walk into another person's life and stay there with everything that staying means. The fire snapped behind her. From the barn, she could just barely hear Samuel's high, clear voice telling the horse something important. She put her hand flat against the cold glass and felt the storm pushing back against her palm. She thought, "I've been a teacher for 3 years, and the thing I learned that Holt never understood is that the most important choice a person can make is to show up. Just show up. even when it's uncertain, even when it's hard, even when you don't know yet if it's going to work. Just show up. She took her hand off the glass and went to start lunch. She hadn't said yes yet. But Thomas Caldwell came back from the barn at noon, stomping snow from his boots, and found his kitchen warm, and his son sitting at the table, and a woman who was teaching his 5-year-old to read the label on a flour sack, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He hung up his coat. He sat down. He said nothing, and Eleanor Whitmore did not look up from the flour sack, but the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. And he saw it, and he looked at his hands, and somewhere in the locked room behind his eyes, something shifted that he would not name for a very long time. The storm kept going. The fire kept burning. And the Caldwell Ranch, which had been cold in all the ways that mattered for 14 months, was a little less cold than it had been yesterday. Eleanor said yes on the second day. She didn't make an announcement of it. She didn't sit Thomas down and deliver a formal answer, the way he had delivered his proposal, flat and direct and without decoration. She simply came downstairs that morning, poured herself coffee, and said, "I have conditions." He looked up from the ledger he was working through at the kitchen table. He had the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for something and had trained himself not to show that he was waiting. "All right," he said. She sat down across from him, not in the chair by the fire. She had quietly made a rule for herself about that chair and folded her hands on the table and said, "First, I will run this household as I see fit. If I decide the boys need to learn to read Latin, they will learn Latin. If I decide they need to spend an afternoon doing nothing but lying in the grass and looking at clouds, that is what they will do. You don't interfere with how I teach them unless you have a specific concrete objection, not a general one." Thomas looked at her steadily. "Define specific and concrete." "I don't want Samuel doing that is not specific. Samuel has a particular fear of horses because of an incident last spring, and I'd like you to know before you put him near one that is specific. The difference is information versus control." He was quiet for a moment. "Agreed. Second," she said, "I will not pretend to feelings I don't have. If the boys ask me if I love them before I've had time to earn that feeling. Honestly, I will tell them I care about them, which is the truth, and that love is something that grows, which is also the truth. I will not perform a family for the sake of comfort." Something moved behind Thomas's eyes. "That might be the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in 14 months. Third," Eleanor said, and her voice shifted slightly, not softer but more careful. "I need you to tell me about their mother." The ledger under Thomas's hands made a small sound as his fingers pressed into it. "Why?" he said. Not a question. A barrier dressed as a question. "Because I am going to be living in her house," Eleanor said, "and sitting at her table and cooking at her stove. Because her sons are going to be watching me every day and comparing me to her whether they mean to or not. Because Daniel already told me which chair was hers without meaning to, and I need to know what I'm navigating before I navigate it wrong and hurt one of those boys because I didn't know better." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas looked at his hands on the ledger for a long moment. "Her name was Catherine," he said. "She was 22 when we married. She died at 31 of a fever that started as nothing and became everything in 4 days." He paused. She was not easy. She was funny, and she was difficult. And she was the kind of woman who rearranged the furniture whenever she felt trapped. And I came home more than once to find the whole front room completely different. Another pause, shorter. The boys loved her completely. Daniel was old enough to understand what happened. Samuel barely remembers her face, which is, he tries not to let Daniel know that because he thinks it would hurt him. Eleanor sat with this carefully. "Is there anything in this house I shouldn't move?" she asked. He looked up at her. "The rocking chair by the front window," he said. "She brought it from her mother's house. Daniel sits in it sometimes." "I won't touch it," Eleanor said. He nodded once. "Anything else?" she asked. "Her Bible is on the shelf in the front room. Don't move it. The pressed flower in the back of it is from our wedding day, and Daniel doesn't know it's there, and I'd like to keep it that way until he's older." "Done," Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was recalibrating something, adjusting his picture of a situation because new information had arrived that he hadn't entirely expected. "You're not what I thought you were going to be," he said. "What did you think I was going to be?" "More afraid," he said, "or more eager. Women who are in desperate situations usually go one way or the other." "I've been in desperate situations before," Eleanor said. "I learned that afraid and eager are both expensive. They make you agree to things you shouldn't and miss things you need to see." She stood up and picked up her coffee. "Do we have an agreement?" Thomas Caldwell stood as well, and for a moment they were face to face across the kitchen table, and the morning light came through the window, and the storm was still going outside, diminished now but persistent, and he said, "We have an agreement." He held out his hand. She shook it firm, brief, professional. "When does the storm break?" she asked. "Tomorrow, most likely. Day after at the latest. Then I'll need to know where you keep things. The pantry inventory, the boys' schedules, the state of the accounts, if you're willing to share them. A household runs on information, and I've been working without any." He blinked, just once. "The accounts. A household this size has supply costs, food costs, wages for the hands' maintenance. If I'm managing this household, I need to know what I'm managing it on. I won't overspend what isn't there, and I won't underspend what is." She paused. "Unless that's outside the agreement." A long moment. "I'll show you the books this afternoon," he said. "Thank you," she said, and went to find out where Catherine Caldwell had kept the flour. Samuel found her in the pantry 20 minutes later. He had dressed himself mostly successfully, though the buttons on his shirt were offset by one, and he was holding his wooden horse and looking at her with the expression of a child who has decided something and is now executing it. "I'm going to show you things," he announced. "What kind of things?" Eleanor asked without stopping her inventory. "Important things, about the ranch, so you know where everything is." He said it with tremendous gravity, as if this were a significant responsibility he had taken on personally. "That would be very helpful," she said, and meant it. "Show me." He showed her everything. He showed her which step on the back stairs creaked, and you had to step over it, or it woke Papa up. He showed her where the barn cats kept their kittens behind a loose board in the feed room. He showed her the corner of the fence where a rabbit came every morning, and the particular rock in the yard that he was saving, because it had a vein of something sparkly in it that he was fairly sure was gold. He showed her where the good apples were kept versus the ones that were going soft. He showed her the hook on the kitchen wall where his father's hat went and explained with patient emphasis that if the hat wasn't on the hook, it meant Papa was outside, and you didn't need to worry. But if the hat was on the hook and Papa wasn't in the house, then something was wrong, and you should find Jake, who was the foreman. "Jake," Eleanor repeated, filing this away. "Jake knows everything," Samuel said with confidence. "Except reading. He can't read very well. Papa tried to teach him, but Jake says letters move around on him." "Some people's eyes work differently," Eleanor said. "It doesn't mean he's not smart." Samuel considered this. "He knows which way a storm is coming from just by smelling the air. That sounds pretty smart to me." "Yeah." Samuel nodded, satisfied. Then, after a brief pause, "Are you going to stay?" Eleanor looked at him, at his round, open face, at the wooden horse pressed against his chest, at the 5-year-old hopefulness of him that was so complete it almost hurt to look at. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to stay." He nodded again with a seriousness that was trying very hard to be casual. "Okay," he said. "Good." Then he turned and went back out the way he'd come, and Eleanor heard him on the stairs stomp careful step over stomp stomp, and the sound of him made something in her chest ache, in the way that only children can make things ache, which is sudden and specific, and has no reasonable explanation. She turned back to her inventory. She wrote down everything. Daniel did not speak to her for the rest of the first day or most of the second. He was present. He ate at the table when she called meals. He did what his father told him to do. He answered direct questions with direct answers, But he moved through the house like a boy who had decided to exist in parallel with her rather than alongside her, and every time he caught himself almost engaging, something would close off in his face, and he would find somewhere else to be. Eleanor let him. She had learned with difficult children, and she had taught enough of them to have real data on this, that the worst thing you could do was pursue. Pursued children retreated further. What they needed was proximity without pressure, which meant you kept showing up in the same spaces, doing the same things, being entirely unalarming, and you waited. She was good at waiting. What she was less good at was ignoring what she saw. And what she saw on the afternoon of the second day was Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, with a piece of paper in front of him and a pencil in his hand, and something written on the paper that he was staring at with an expression that was beyond frustration. It was the expression of someone who has tried and failed at the same thing so many times that the failing has started to feel like a verdict. She put a plate of biscuits on the table near him and didn't say anything. He didn't say anything either. She started on dinner. After about 10 minutes, he said without looking up, "I can't make this right." She didn't turn around. "What are you trying to make right?" "The numbers." A pause. "It's supposed to come out the same on both sides. Papa showed me, but it doesn't come out the same and I can't find where it went wrong." Eleanor dried her hands and came to the table and looked at the paper. She saw immediately where the error was: a simple transposition in the third row 7, written as 1 in a column cascading wrong from there, but she didn't say so. "Can I sit?" she asked. He looked at her, looked at the paper. "I guess." She sat down. "Walk me through what you did." He walked her through it. His voice was stiff at first, reluctant, the voice of a boy who has decided to accept help only under protest. But as he went through the columns, something shifted. The problem drew him in, the way problems draw people who are fundamentally good at thinking. And by the time he reached the third row, he was talking faster, less self-conscious, following the logic of it. "There," Eleanor said quietly. "Third row. What did you write for that number?" He looked closer. "That's a 1, he said. "It should be a 7. He stopped. He went back through the subsequent rows. She watched his face as he traced the error forward through all its consequences, as he saw exactly how one small mistake had thrown everything off. "Oh," he said. "It happens," she said. "To everyone. In accounting and mathematics, in everything, one wrong number and the whole thing lies to you. The skill isn't avoiding mistakes, it's knowing how to look for them." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He erased the 1, wrote the 7, corrected the columns that followed. He checked the totals. They came out even. He let out a breath that was very long for an 8-year-old. "Thank you," he said, flat, contained, but genuine. She could hear it under the containment. "You did it," she said. "I just stood here." He looked at her, then a direct look, the first one he'd given her, that wasn't surveillance. It lasted only a moment, but it was real. Then he picked up the paper and left the table, and Eleanor went back to dinner, and neither of them made anything of it. But she thought there. That was the beginning. Not friendship, not trust, just the first crack in the wall, small as a pencil line, and enough for now. Thomas showed her the accounts that afternoon, as promised. He spread the ledgers on the kitchen table and stood beside her while she went through them, and for the first half hour, he stood with his arms crossed and his weight back, the posture of a man who is letting someone look at something private and is not entirely sure he made the right decision. Then she asked a question he hadn't expected. "What's this entry?" She pointed to a recurring figure in the expense column 4 months back, repeated irregularly. "This amount, it's not a standard supply cost. It's not wages. It doesn't match any of the ranch maintenance patterns. It's paid out in irregular intervals, but it's always the same figure." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's a payment to Gerald Holt's brother-in-law," he said. Eleanor looked up. "He holds a note on the east pasture," Thomas said. 20 acres best grazing land on the property. I borrowed against it 3 years ago to replace the breeding stock after a bad winter. The terms were reasonable at the time." He paused. "They have become less reasonable." How less reasonable? The interest rate in the note has a provision I didn't fully account for when I signed it. In the second year of the agreement, the rate adjusts based on the assessed value of the land. He stopped. The land assessment went up 14 months ago, the same month Catherine died. Eleanor looked at him carefully. Is that a coincidence? The assessor is married to Holt's cousin, Thomas said. The kitchen was very quiet. How long do you have before the payments become unmanageable? She asked. 18 months at current cattle prices. 12 if the prices drop, which they likely will if the northern routes don't open by spring. He said it with the flat practicality of a man who has run the numbers many times and arrived at the same answer each time and has decided that the answer is what it is. Eleanor looked back at the ledger. May I work through these? She asked. Why? Because I can read contracts, she said. I taught myself 3 years ago when I was trying to fight the board over the school's supply budget. The chairman was routing school funds into his own property maintenance and calling it infrastructure costs. I learned enough contract law to identify exactly what he was doing. I couldn't prove it, I didn't have access to the right documents, but I learned what to look for. She looked up at him. I'd like to look at the note on the east pasture, the original document. Thomas looked at her for a moment. You're a school teacher, he said. I was a school teacher, she said. Currently, I'm the woman managing this household, and this household includes that pasture, and I would like to look at the document. He went and got it. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly working through each provision, the way she'd learned to not looking for what it said on its face, but looking for what it assumed, what it left undefined, what it promised that could be interpreted 2 ways. Thomas sat across from her and waited. He had uncrossed his arms somewhere in the second reading. He was watching her with the intent expression of a man who has run out of ideas and is watching someone else run through theirs. Here, she said finally. She pointed to a clause in the second page subsection 4, the language dense and unhelpfully passive. The provision about the assessed value. It says the rate adjusts in accordance with the assessed valuation as determined by the county assessor's office. It doesn't specify which assessment. It doesn't say most recent. It says as determined by. Thomas leaned forward and read the clause. That's the same thing. It isn't, Eleanor said. As determined by means the value requires an active determination, a current formal assessment conducted for the purpose of this adjustment. If Holt's brother-in-law is using the routine county land assessment, which goes on your record without your involvement, that's not a determination conducted for the purpose of this provision. This clause requires that you be notified and that an assessment be conducted specifically for this adjustment. She looked at him. Were you notified? Thomas was very still. No. Did anyone come out to assess the east pasture specifically before the rate changed? No. Then the adjustment may not be legally valid, she said. This doesn't guarantee anything. I'm not a lawyer and I could be reading this wrong, but I think you need a lawyer to look at this clause because if I'm right, you've been paying an inflated rate for 14 months that was never properly triggered. Thomas looked at the document for a long time. When he looked up, his expression was different, not open. Thomas Caldwell's face didn't do open, but something had shifted in it, some fundamental recalibration. He looked at her, the way you look at something that has turned out to be other than what you cataloged it as. You found that in 1 reading, he said. 3 readings, she corrected. Most people wouldn't have found it in 30. Most people read contracts looking for what they mean, she said. You have to read them looking for what they don't say. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people look at the ceiling when they're recalculating something very large. I've been paying that inflated rate for 14 months, he said. Yes. Because I signed something I didn't read carefully enough. You signed something that was written to be not read carefully enough, she said. That's different. And it's also a description of exactly how men like Holt's brother-in-law make their money. They draft provisions that look straightforward and aren't. Thomas brought his eyes back down from the ceiling and looked at her across the kitchen table. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it register not as intimacy, but as a shift in classification. She had been a situation. Now she was a person he was talking to. "Why didn't you use this when you were fighting Holt over the school funds?" "I told you, I didn't have access to the documents. I knew what he was doing, and I could see the shape of it, but without the actual contracts, I couldn't prove the specific mechanism." She paused. "You have the document." "We have the document," he said. Quietly. Precisely. As if he had made a decision about something. He stood up. "I'll write to the lawyer in Miles City tonight. James Carver, he's honest, which is rarer than it should be. I've used him before. Send him a copy of subsection 4 with my annotation," she said. "I'll write out exactly what I'm seeing so he doesn't have to read around it." Thomas nodded. He picked up the document and then set it back down again. "How did you know to look?" he said. "At the provision. Most people would have read it and moved on." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ledger, at the irregular payments that had been quietly draining this ranch for over a year. "Because I grew up poor," she said, "and I watched my mother sign things because she didn't know what else to do, and we didn't have anyone to read them for us. And I decided I would learn to read everything." She paused. "People like Holt count on other people not reading carefully. It's the whole system." Thomas said nothing for a moment, then very quietly, "Thank you." She nodded. "Get me the lawyer's address, and I'll write up the annotation tonight." The storm broke the following morning. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky clear first at the edges, then sweeping across the blue, coming in hard and cold and absolutely bright, the way Montana sky always arrived after a storm, like it had something to prove. The world outside was white and still and enormous. She thought, "I could leave now. The roads will be passable by midday. I could walk to the stage stop at Jefferson Crossing, which is only 6 miles east, and be on my way to Miles City by nightfall." She thought I said yes. She poured herself coffee and went to wake the boys for breakfast. Jake the foreman came to the house that afternoon. He was a big man, not Thomas. Big, but broadly built, with a face like a friendly cliff, and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who has been on ranches his whole life, and has learned that sudden gestures make animals and children nervous. He took off his hat when Eleanor opened the door, and he looked at her with eyes that were very much like Samuel's had been that first night, cautious for approximately 3 seconds, and then entirely replacing caution with something warmer. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Jake Reeves. I run the hands." "I know," she said. "Samuel told me about you. He says you can smell which way a storm is coming." Jake grinned a wide, sudden grin that completely transformed his face. "Samuel told you that, did he?" He was very impressed. "Well," he was still grinning, "I just pay attention to the air. Mr. Caldwell said you'd be—" He stopped working for the right word. "Staying," Eleanor supplied. "Staying," he agreed. "Good. The boys need—" He stopped again. He was a man who clearly said what he thought and occasionally surprised himself with it. "The boys need someone steady, that's all." "That's what I'm here to be," Eleanor said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. "I'll let the hands know. So they're not—" Another stop, another search. "So they're not surprised?" "Surprised that I exist?" she asked. "Surprised that you're the kind that stays," he said. "We've had some that weren't. It's hard on the boys when someone comes and goes." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I'm the kind that stays, Mr. Reeves." He looked at her for a moment. The same measuring look Thomas did, but warmer, more direct, less defended. Then he nodded with a finality that told her she'd just passed some evaluation she hadn't known she was being given. "Jake," he said, "nobody calls me Mr. Reeves, except people I owe money to." The letter to James Carver went out with the next rider to Miles City. Thomas wrote it himself with Eleanor's annotation added on a separate sheet in her careful, precise handwriting. He sealed it without showing her the letter, but he showed her the annotation to confirm it was correct before he sealed it. She read it over, changed one word, suggests, to indicates, a difference of certainty. He raised an eyebrow. Suggests gives him room to discount it, she said. The clause either means what I'm saying it means or it doesn't. Indicates tells him we're confident. Are we confident? He asked. Confident enough to send the letter, she said. Less confident than that, and we shouldn't send it at all. He changed the word. He sealed the envelope. That night, after the boys were in bed, Thomas came to the kitchen where Eleanor was going through the pantry inventory again, making a list of what needed to be ordered before the next potential storm, and he sat down at the table and said without preamble, I need to tell you something. Eleanor looked up. The arrangement I proposed, he said. I need you to understand that I meant what I said. Separate lives. I'm not going to... I have no interest in making this difficult for you. I didn't think you were, she said. Catherine's family is in Missouri, he said. Her mother, an aunt. They write to the boys at Christmas. He paused. They're going to find out about this arrangement. When they do, they may write some things that are... They loved her very much, and they're going to have feelings about someone being in her house. Eleanor was quiet. She set down her pencil. Are you warning me? I'm informing you, he said. So it's not a surprise. She looked at him across the kitchen table. The lamp between them cast a steady warm light, and outside the window the night was perfectly clear and very cold and full of stars, the way Montana nights were after a storm. What was Catherine like with them? She asked. Thomas was very still for a moment. She was the favorite, he said, of both of them. She was the kind of person who kept everyone together. When she died, they lost their center. And the boys are part of their center now, Eleanor said. Yes. She thought for a moment. Write to them before they find out from someone else. Tell them yourself. Tell them the arrangement is practical, which is true, and that the boys' welfare is the first concern, which is also true. She paused. And tell them they're welcome to come and see for themselves if they want to. Thomas looked at her. That might be more complicated than it sounds. Most true things are, she said. But it's better than them hearing it from someone else and constructing a version in their heads that's worse than the reality. He was quiet for a long moment. You think about 3 steps ahead, he said. Occupational habit, she said. Teaching children means you're always managing what's coming before it arrives. He stood up. He put his hand on the back of the chair for a moment briefly, the gesture of a man who is going to say something else and then changes his mind. Good night, Eleanor, he said. Good night, Thomas, she said. He walked to the stairs. She heard his footsteps go up heavy, regular, the walk of a man who is very tired, in the particular way that grief tires people, not in the body, but in the place behind the eyes where everything gets processed. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Outside the stars, inside the lamp, and from upstairs before everything went quiet, the sound of Thomas Caldwell's footsteps stopping at one door. Just stopping for about 10 seconds, not going in, and then continuing down the hall to his own room. She thought he stops at Daniel's door every night. She thought he probably doesn't know she knows that. She thought that man is holding so much together with nothing but stubbornness and routine, and the absolute refusal to let anything else fall apart. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the east pasture and the clause in the note, and the way Thomas had said, "We have the document quietly," precisely as if a line had been drawn somewhere, and she had ended up on his side of it, without either of them making a formal announcement. She thought about Daniel's face when the columns came out even. She thought about Samuel's wooden horse and his careful step over the creaking stair. She thought about Catherine's rocking chair by the front window and the pressed flower in the back of the Bible that Daniel didn't know about yet. And she thought, I am already inside this family. I came in out of the storm 2 days ago, and I am already in every way that isn't legal inside this. Not as a mother, not as a wife, as something that doesn't have a name yet. Something that is going to take a long time to understand. Something that if she was being completely honest with herself at 11 o'clock at night in a dark room in a stranger's house, that was beginning to feel less like a stranger's house, she was not entirely sure she minded. She turned over, pulled the blanket up, and closed her eyes. Downstairs, the fire settled. The ranch was quiet. And in the morning there would be breakfast to make, and boys to wake, and a household to learn, and a contract note to fight, and a life she hadn't planned and hadn't chosen, but had walked toward through a blizzard because there was light in the window. That was enough for tonight. Tomorrow would ask its own questions. The letter from James Carver arrived 17 days after Thomas sent it. Eleanor was teaching Samuel his letters at the kitchen table when Thomas came in from the yard with the envelope in his hand. She knew immediately it was important not from his face, which didn't change, but from the way he was carrying it with the careful, contained energy of a man who has been waiting for something and is now regulating his reaction to its arrival. "From Carver?" she asked. "Yes." He sat down. He opened it with his pocket knife, not hurrying the way he did everything with the deliberate patience of a man who has learned that rushing reveals too much. He read it once. Then he set it on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. "Well," Eleanor said. "You were right," he said. "About the clause." Something in her chest released a tension she hadn't entirely acknowledged she was carrying. "What does he say exactly?" Thomas slid the letter across the table. She picked it up and read it, aware of Samuel watching both of them with the complete unself-conscious attention of a 5-year-old tracking adult weather. Carver's language was careful legal caution dressed in plain speech, but the substance was clear. The assessment provision required formal notification and a purpose-specific determination. The routine county assessment did not satisfy the clause. Every inflated payment made over the past 14 months had been collected on a rate adjustment that had never been legally triggered. Holt's brother-in-law, a man named Warren Price Eleanor, now knew had been collecting the difference without legal basis. "He says he can file a formal challenge," Eleanor said. "Recover the overpayments." "He says he believes he can," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference." "Yes," she agreed. "But he also says Price will likely settle, rather than let it go to court, because a court proceeding means the clause gets read publicly, and Price has notes with 3 other ranch owners in this county with similar provisions. If one challenge succeeds, all 3 become vulnerable." Thomas looked at her. "You read legal documents faster than anyone I've ever met." "I read everything fast," she said. "It was the only way to stay ahead of Gerald Holt." Samuel, who had been following this exchange with careful attention, said, "Is someone being bad?" Thomas and Eleanor looked at him simultaneously. "Someone has been unfair," Eleanor said, "and we're going to try to fix it." Samuel considered this. "Like when Daniel takes my horse and says he didn't." "Exactly like that," Eleanor said, "except with more paperwork." Thomas made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood as one. It was the first time Eleanor had heard anything like it from him, and it was brief, a small surprised exhale. But she noticed it and filed it away the way she filed everything, not for use, but because it mattered. She handed the letter back. "Write to Carver tonight. Tell him to file the challenge. That's a fight with Price," Thomas said, "and through Price with Holt." "You were already in that fight," she said. "You just didn't know the other side had started it." He took the letter. He folded it along its original crease and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at her with that particular measuring look, the one she'd stopped trying to interpret, and had started simply receiving as what it was, the way Thomas Caldwell acknowledged something. "All right," he said. He stood. He looked at Samuel. "Letters," he said. "Keep going." "I know A through G," Samuel reported. "Good," Thomas said. "Know A through Z by supper." "That's 26 letters," Samuel said, alarmed. 19 to go. You have until supper." He walked out. Samuel looked at Eleanor with an expression of pure betrayal. "He's not serious about supper," she said. "But let's do 3 more right now. What comes after G?" Daniel came to her that same afternoon. not in the careful sideways manner he'd been using the orbit that never quite approached the questions that came through Samuel as intermediary. He came directly, which told Eleanor something significant had shifted, though she kept her face entirely neutral and waited. He had a book. Not a school primer, a real book, thick-spined, well-used, the cover worn to softness. He set it on the table beside her without explanation. She looked at it. The Count of Monte Cristo. Abridged but still substantial. The kind of book that got read until it fell apart and then got read some more. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Mama's shelf," he said. "She had a lot of books. Papa doesn't read them, he just keeps them." A pause, short and careful. "She liked this one best. She read it to me twice. I was trying to read it myself, but there are words I can't—" He stopped. His jaw did the tight thing. "I can read fine," he said immediately. "I just don't know some of the words." "That's what reading is," Eleanor said. "Finding words you don't know yet and learning them." She picked up the book and opened it to the first page. "Sit down." He sat. "Don't read to me," he said quickly. "I'm not a baby." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm going to read the first paragraph myself so I can hear where the rhythm is, and then you're going to read the next one out loud so I can hear where you are. That's how I figure out which words are new to you. It's not reading to you. It's calibration." He looked at her. The word had caught him. Calibration. "Adjusting your approach based on information you collect first," she said. "Like how your father checks the herd before he decides how to run the day. You don't manage something without knowing its current state." Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "That's what teaching is. That's what good teaching is," she said. "The other kind just assumes everyone starts from the same place." He thought about this for another moment. Then he said, with the careful indifference of an 8-year-old trying not to show he finds something interesting, "Gerald Holt's school did that, assumed everyone was the same." "Yes," Eleanor said, "it did." "Peter Grady's not the same as everyone," Daniel said. "He thinks about things sideways. My mama used to say that was the best kind of mind." Eleanor looked at the book in her hands and felt something very specific, a kind of careful, attentive grief for a woman she'd never met, who had apparently been exactly the kind of person this territory needed more of. "Your mother sounds like she was very smart," she said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "She was the smartest person I ever knew." Another pause. "Papa's smart too, but different. She thought about people. He thinks about problems." "Good thing to have both kinds in a family," Eleanor said. Daniel looked at her. It was the longest look he'd given her that wasn't surveillance, something more like genuine consideration. "You think about both," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation precise and delivered without decoration, the way an 8-year-old who thinks carefully delivers observations. "I try to," Eleanor said. He nodded once minimally, the way his father nodded. "All right," he said. "Calibrate." She read the first paragraph. He read the second. They worked through 6 pages before supper, and she stopped 3 times for words. Edification, ominous dispensation. And each time she didn't define the word, she asked him to work it out from what was around it, and each time he did mostly. And the once he couldn't, she walked him through the logic of the surrounding sentences until he found it himself. When she called supper, he closed the book carefully and set it on the table between them, not taking it with him. She understood. He was leaving it there, so it would be there next time. Catherine's mother wrote 3 weeks after the storm. Thomas brought the letter to Eleanor directly, which told her everything about what was in it before she read a word. He didn't hand it to her. He put it on the table and stepped back as if giving her room to react. She picked it up and read it. Margaret Hollis. Catherine's mother wrote in the careful, controlled penmanship of a woman who had composed herself thoroughly before setting pen to paper and was keeping herself composed through the act of writing. The letter was 5 pages long. Eleanor read all 5. The substance stripped of its composure. Margaret Hollis was devastated. She was not angry at Thomas. She was careful to say this 3 times in 5 pages, which told Eleanor she was somewhat angry at Thomas. She was not opposed to the welfare of her grandsons. She was careful to say this as well. What she was opposed to was the speed of it, the practicality of it, the frank transactional nature of what Thomas had described in his letter, and the fact that some woman she had never met was now living in her daughter's house. She had not said some woman exactly. She had said Miss Whitmore, of whom I know nothing, which was the same sentiment with better manners. And then on the 4th page, where the composure had thinned the most, she had written, "I trust you to take care of my grandsons, Thomas. I have always trusted you in that. But I need you to understand that those boys are all I have left of my daughter. And if this arrangement hurts them in any way that you cannot see, because you are in the middle of it, I need someone to tell me." Eleanor put the letter down. Thomas was watching her. "She's asking for honesty," Eleanor said, "and she's frightened, and she's being very dignified about both." "What do you want to do?" he asked. The question surprised her, not that he asked, but the way he asked it. "What do you want to do?" As if this were her decision to make, or at least equally her decision. "I want to write to her myself," Eleanor said. "Not through you, directly." Thomas was very still. "Why?" "Because she doesn't need reassurance from you. She has that. What she needs is to form her own opinion of me, and she can't do that through a letter you write on my behalf." She paused. "She's a smart woman. You can hear it in every sentence. She'll know if you're vouching for me. She needs to encounter me herself." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "What are you going to say?" "The truth," she said. "That I came in out of a storm and found a household that needed someone steady, and that's what I'm trying to be. That I'm not Catherine, and I know I'm not Catherine, and I'm not trying to be. That her grandsons are extraordinary children, and the evidence for that is the woman who raised them." She paused. "And that if she wants to come and see for herself, the door is open." Thomas's jaw worked once the way it did when he was moving something very large in a very small space internally. "That last part," he said. "I know," Eleanor said, "but it's the right thing." He turned and walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her. She waited. "She's a good woman," he said finally to the window. "Margaret, she and I were never. Catherine was the one who managed that relationship. After Catherine died, I didn't know how to—" He stopped. "I wrote at Christmas because the boys needed me to. But it was hard." "I know," Eleanor said again. He turned around. Something in his face was more open than she'd seen it, not all the way open, but more than before, one more layer down. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote it that evening. 4 pages, which surprised her. She had expected 2. But Margaret Hollis deserved 4 pages, and she wrote them honestly, and the one thing she did not write was any promise about the future, because she'd learned from Thomas that the only honest currency was what you actually knew. She knew she was here. She knew she was trying. That was what she wrote. Yeah. The rustlers came on a Thursday. Eleanor was in the barn with Samuel. He had developed the habit of bringing his morning lessons there on the grounds that the horses were better students than he was, and therefore inspiring. When she heard the horses coming fast from the South Ridge, too many of them, too close together, at the wrong time of day, for any legitimate ranch business, she grabbed Samuel's arm before he could move toward the door. "Stay here," she said. "What?" "Stay here and be quiet." She said it in her teaching voice, the one that wasn't loud, but was absolutely certain, and Samuel went still immediately, because he'd learned in 3 weeks what all her students eventually learned, which was that that voice was not negotiating. She went to the barn door and looked through the gap. 4 riders, unknown, coming in fast from the direction of the south pasture, where Thomas kept 30 of his best cattle. Jake was already out of the bunkhouse and in the yard, and 2 of the hands were coming around from the feed house, and the whole thing had the tight, charged quality of something that was about to happen very fast. One of the riders pulled up in the yard. He was a big man, not in the way Jake was big, but in the way that wants to be noticed. He looked around the yard with the casual entitlement of someone who has decided in advance that he belongs anywhere he arrives. "Caldwell," the man said. Not a question. Thomas came out of the ranch house. He had his rifle. He was not pointing it. He was carrying it at his side with the relaxed certainty of a man who doesn't need to point it to communicate his position. "Sloan," Thomas said. Eleanor filed the name. She did not recognize it, but she filed it. "Lost some cattle," Sloan said. "Thought they might have wandered onto your range." "My range is fenced," Thomas said. "Fences get gaps," Sloan said pleasantly, "especially in bad winters. My fences don't." A pause. The three men behind Sloan were spread in an arc that was not accidental. She could see from the barn that the spacing was calculated, each man positioned to cover a different part of the yard. "I'd like to take a look," Sloan said. "Just to be sure, you understand." "I don't need you to look at my stock," Thomas said. "If you're missing cattle, file with the county sheriff. That's what he's there for." "The sheriff's a 2-day ride in this weather," Sloan said. His voice had changed, still pleasant on the surface, but with something harder running under it now, the way ice looks like water until you hit it. "Thought we could handle this neighborly." "Neighborly would be you turning around," Thomas said. Eleanor had her hand on Samuel's shoulder behind her. She could feel him vibrating with the effort of staying still and quiet. Sloan looked at the ranch house, at the barn around the yard. The look was proprietary, the look of a man cataloging what was in front of him. "Nice spread," Sloan said. "Big operation for one man. Hear you've been having some financial trouble. Notes coming due." Thomas said nothing. His hands on the rifle were completely still. "Sometimes a man in that position is open to arrangements," Sloan said. "Buyers who appreciate good land. Fair price, quick close." "Get off my property," Thomas said. The pleasantness dropped. "You're going to want to think carefully." "Jake," Thomas said. Jake stepped forward from the bunkhouse. The two hands came fully around from the feed house. There were 4 of them total, and the hands were not carrying rifles, but they were carrying themselves like men who didn't need them. Sloan looked at the 4 of them. He looked at Thomas. He did the arithmetic. "We'll be seeing each other," he said, and turned his horse and rode out, and his men followed, and Eleanor stood in the barn with her hand on Samuel's shoulder and her heart running faster than she would admit, and watched them go. Thomas didn't move until they were fully out of the yard. Then he lowered the rifle and said to Jake, "Ride the south fence line today. All of it." "Already planning on it," Jake said. Thomas turned and looked at the barn. He couldn't see her through the gap, but she had the sudden absolute certainty that he knew exactly where she was. She opened the barn door and came out, keeping Samuel behind her. Thomas crossed the yard to her in 10 steps. He looked at Samuel first, a fast, comprehensive look that confirmed the boy was fine, and then at Eleanor. "You stayed in the barn," he said. "Yes, good." He looked at Samuel again. "Go to Jake," he said. "Stay with him today." "Who was that man?" Samuel asked. "Someone who made a mistake," Thomas said. "Go with Jake." Samuel went. Thomas watched him cross the yard to Jake, who put a hand on the boy's shoulder and walked him toward the fence line. Thomas turned back to Eleanor. They were alone in the yard. "Sloan," she said. "Who is he?" "His name is Cal Sloan. He's been buying up distressed properties in the north part of the territory for 2 years. Ranches that have gone under land that's been lost to debt." He paused. "He's come by twice before. Both times I told him the same thing." "He mentioned notes coming due," Eleanor said. "He knows about price." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Yes." "That's not coincidence," she said. "Price told him. Or someone connected to Price." "No," Thomas agreed. "It's not coincidence." She stood with this for a moment, working through it. "Sloan doesn't want your cattle. He never did. He came to see the state of things, to see if you're close enough to the edge that a pressure campaign would work." Thomas looked at her. "That's exactly right. Then we need Carver to move faster," she said. If we can recover the overpayments from Price and challenge the rate adjustment before Sloan applies more pressure, we change the financial picture enough that the pressure stops working." She paused. "How fast can Carver move?" "I'll write tonight," Thomas said. "Explain that the situation has changed." He was looking at her steadily. "Eleanor." "What?" "You just walked out of that barn toward 4 armed men because you didn't want Samuel to be alone." She blinked. "I kept Samuel behind me." "I know what you did," he said. "I saw what you did." His voice was not angry. It was not even worried. It was something else, something that didn't have a name in his usual vocabulary, she suspected. "Thank you," he said, "and don't do it again." "I'll do what the situation requires," she said. "The situation requires you to stay in the barn," he said with a flatness that was not anger, but was very final. The situation required someone to know where Samuel was, and to keep him quiet and contained, she said, matching his flatness precisely. "Which I did. If you want to argue about the tactics, do it after we've dealt with Price and Sloan." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the ranch house without another word. She thought I won that argument. She also thought he was scared, not for the ranch, not for the cattle. The look on his face when he'd crossed the yard toward her, the 10 fast steps, the comprehensive look at Samuel, and then at her. That had not been a man assessing a situation. That had been a man who had been frightened. She filed that too, carefully. In the place where she kept things that mattered, but weren't ready to be looked at directly yet. Daniel found out about Sloan that evening. She hadn't planned to tell him he was 8, and it wasn't his concern, but she came into the front room after supper, and he was sitting in Catherine's rocking chair with his arms crossed, and the specific expression of a boy who has heard things through walls that adults believed were more soundproof than they are. "Was it about the land?" he asked. Eleanor sat down across from him. She thought about softening it and decided against it. Daniel was 8 and had decided to be careful about people. Careful people recognized when they were being managed, and when they recognized it, they trusted you less. "A man came about the land, yes," she said. "He's been buying properties in the territory that are having financial difficulty." "Is our property having financial difficulty?" "There's a legal question about a note on the east pasture," she said. "We're working on resolving it. Mr. Carver in Miles City is helping." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "Papa looks like he doesn't want you to know about the money part." "He showed me the books himself," she said. Something shifted in Daniel's face, a small recalibration like a compass needle settling. "He did. The first day I was here." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "He didn't show Mama the books," he said. "She used to ask, and he'd say he had it managed. She used to tell Jake it was because he didn't want her to worry, but she said she thought it was actually because he didn't want her to think he couldn't handle things." Eleanor sat with this very carefully. She was aware she was receiving information that was intimate and perhaps more than Daniel had intended to give. And she was aware that the way she received it would determine whether he ever gave her anything again. "Some people learn to handle things alone," she said, "and then have trouble stopping even when they don't have to." Daniel looked at his hands. She used to say he was the most capable and loneliest person she'd ever met. The words landed with a particular precision. Eleanor said nothing. "I'm not supposed to know she said that," Daniel added. "I heard it through a door. She was talking to Jake's wife." "I won't tell him," Eleanor said. He looked up. "I know," he said. Just that simply and with complete certainty. "I know." As if somewhere in the past 3 weeks he had made a decision about her and was only now stating it plainly. She held that very carefully. She didn't respond to it directly, because responding to it directly would make it a moment, and moments made children retreat. "We should write back to your grandmother," she said instead. "She asked about you specifically. Not through your father, she wants to hear from you." Daniel blinked. "She wrote to us. She wrote to your father, but she asked about you. Both of you." She paused. "I wrote to her myself this week. I thought she deserved to hear about you from someone who sees you every day." He stared at her. "What did you say?" "That you could find a mathematical error in a ledger and correct the entire cascade in under a minute," she said. "That you read Dumas and ask questions that most grown men wouldn't think to ask. That you're the kind of person who notices which chair matters and why, and that tells me everything about the kind of man you're going to be." The color that came into Daniel Caldwell's face was one of the most complex things Eleanor had ever watched. Embarrassment and pleasure and grief all arriving simultaneously, each one real. "You told her about the chair," he said. "I told her you're careful about what matters," Eleanor said, "which is exactly what I said." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he uncurled himself from the rocking chair slowly, with the particular grace of a child who has decided to trust something, and he said, "I'm going to write to her tonight, if you'll help me with the spelling." "I'll be at the kitchen table," she said. He walked past her toward the stairs. He stopped for a moment at the doorway with his back to her. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. "Yes," she said. He didn't turn around. "Thank you," he said, "for what you told her." Then he went up the stairs over the creaking step, and she heard him in his room, the sound of a drawer opening, the scratch of a chair on the floor. Eleanor sat alone in the front room for a moment. Catherine's rocking chair was still moving slightly, the ghost of Daniel's weight still in it. She thought about a woman who had read The Count of Monte Cristo twice to her son, who had rearranged furniture when she felt trapped, who had told Jake's wife that her husband was the most capable and loneliest person she'd ever met. She thought, "I would have liked you, Catherine Caldwell." She thought, "I think you would have liked me too." She got up and went to the kitchen table and waited for Daniel to come down with his letter. Thomas came in from the barn at 9 o'clock and found them at the kitchen table, Daniel writing Eleanor beside him, not dictating, but available, the lamp between them, casting a doubled shadow on the wall. He stood in the doorway. Neither of them had heard him come in. He watched his son's hand move across the paper, watched Eleanor lean in once to point at something. Watched. Daniel corrected himself. Watched his son sit back with the satisfaction of a thing done right. Thomas stood there for a long time. He was not a man who was easy with feelings. He knew this about himself, the way you know things about yourself that you've worked around for so long. They've become part of the architecture of how you live. Catherine had known it too, had worked around it with humor and stubbornness and the occasional piece of rearranged furniture. He had loved her for knowing it, without requiring him to change. He looked at his son at the kitchen table. He looked at Eleanor. He thought, "She is doing something I cannot do, not better, not instead of him, but a specific thing he did not have the access to, do the way some doors only open from certain directions, and she was standing on that side of the door." He thought about 14 months of supper tables where Daniel performed being fine so that Thomas wouldn't have to worry, and Thomas performed not worrying so that Daniel wouldn't feel like a burden. The two of them circling each other with the careful distance of two people who love each other completely and are terrified that showing it will cost something they can't afford. He thought about this woman who had walked 4 miles in a blizzard and shown up on his doorstep and shaken his hand across a kitchen table and said, "I will not perform a family for the sake of comfort," and had proceeded to be one anyway. Not performed. Actual. Daniel looked up and saw his father in the doorway. "I'm writing to grandmother," Daniel said. There was the faintest note of defensiveness in it, the reflex of a boy who expects to be told he should be in bed, but under it clearly was something else. Pride, small and new and very real. "I know," Thomas said. "Let me read it when you're done." Daniel blinked. "You want to read it?" "She's my family too," Thomas said. He said it simply without explanation and walked to the stove to pour himself coffee, and Daniel turned back to the letter with an expression on his face that Thomas mercifully did not see because his back was turned. Eleanor saw it. She kept her face entirely neutral and her eyes on the table and felt something in her chest that was large and warm and had no name that she was going to assign to it tonight. She thought, good. She thought, this is what it looks like when something starts to heal. She thought, don't make it into anything yet. Just let it be what it is. Daniel finished his letter. He handed it to his father. Thomas read it standing by the stove, coffee in hand, and his face did what Thomas Caldwell's face did. Kept itself. Still kept itself measured. Kept everything inside where he maintained sole custody of it. But his hand, the one not holding the coffee cup, pressed flat against the counter for a moment. Just a moment. And Eleanor saw that too. She gathered the papers from the table. "Bed," she said to Daniel. "You wrote well tonight. Your grandmother is going to be very glad to hear from you." He went without argument, which itself was a kind of milestone, and they heard the stairs, the careful step over the creak, the footsteps across the hall. Thomas set the letter on the table. He and Eleanor were alone in the kitchen. She waited. "He hasn't written to her since the funeral," Thomas said. "I had to write for him. He said he didn't know what to say." "He knew tonight," Eleanor said. "Yes." A pause. "Because of what you told her. He had something to respond to." She stood up, put her shawl around her shoulders. "He had something real to say. I just gave him a reason to say it." Thomas looked at her. He looked for a long time, long enough that it wasn't assessment anymore or classification. Long enough that it was something else. Something she wasn't going to name tonight, not for him and not for herself. "The mortgage note," he said. "Carver thinks we can recover 14 months of overpayments." "I know," she said. "If he's right," Thomas said, "that changes the picture considerably. Enough that Sloane's pressure loses its leverage." "Yes. That would not have happened," he said, "without you reading that document." She picked up the lamp. "Go to bed, Thomas," she said. "You've been up since 4. He looked at her for one more moment. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She walked to her room at the end of the hall and closed the door and put the lamp on the small table and stood in the quiet dark for a moment before she lit it again. Outside the window, the Montana sky was black and absolute and impossibly full of stars. Inside the ranch house, everything was still. And in that stillness, something that had no name yet continued to grow the way things grow in hard ground, slowly, without announcement, pushing up through cold and resistance, and all the reasonable arguments against it, quietly, steadily, the way things grow when they intend to last. Margaret Hollis arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Eleanor's letter. Nobody had warned them she was coming. Her reply to Eleanor had said only that she appreciated the honesty and would be in touch, which Eleanor had taken to mean a letter. What it had apparently meant was a woman who packed a trunk and booked passage on the first available stage to Montana without informing anyone of her plans, because Margaret Hollis was, as Eleanor would come to understand very quickly, not a woman who asked permission to do what she had decided to do. Thomas heard the stage from inside the barn and came out with the particular alertness of a man who tracks sounds that don't belong. And he stood in the yard when the door opened and watched his mother-in-law climb down without assistance and stand in the cold air of the Caldwell yard and look at him with eyes that were so entirely Catherine's that something moved in his face that he couldn't quite stop. "Margaret," he said. "Thomas," she said. "You look terrible." "I've been sleeping fine," he said. "Sleep isn't the same as rest," she said, and walked past him toward the house. Eleanor was at the kitchen table with Samuel doing his arithmetic when the front door opened. She heard the step, not Thomas, not Jake, not any of the hands, and looked up to see a woman in her late 50s standing in the kitchen doorway with a traveling coat and sharp gray eyes that swept the room with the efficient comprehensiveness of someone who has come to see exactly what there is to see and intends to see all of it. The eyes stopped on Eleanor. Eleanor stood up. The two women looked at each other across the kitchen. Samuel, who had no instinct for loaded silences, said, "Who are you?" The woman looked at him. Something in her face went very soft, very fast. The instantaneous, involuntary softness of a grandmother who has been missing her grandchildren and has just seen one of them. But she controlled it quickly, with the practice of a woman who has learned that feelings shown too freely cost you something in certain negotiations. "I'm your grandmother," she said. "Your mother's mother. Do you remember me?" Samuel thought about this. "You sent the candy at Christmas," he said. "I did." "It was good candy," he said. "Papa let us have it before supper, which he never does." Margaret looked at Thomas, who had come in behind her. "Fatherhood has made you soft," she said. "It was Christmas," Thomas said. She looked back at Eleanor. She walked to the table and stopped 3 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to make it clear this was not warmth yet. It was approach. The distance between them was a question, not an answer. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Hollis," Eleanor said. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," Margaret said. "That was intentional." She looked at the arithmetic papers on the table, at the pot on the stove, at the lamp on the counter, and the flower on the shelf, and the small carved horse sitting on the windowsill where Samuel had left it that morning. She was cataloging just as Eleanor had cataloged everything her first days here. She was reading the room for what it told her about the woman who ran it. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "You've traveled a long way." "I have," Margaret said, and she sat not in the nearest chair Eleanor noticed, but in the chair across from where Eleanor had been sitting, across the table, a position where she could see everything. Eleanor poured coffee and set it in front of her and sat back down in her own chair, and the two women looked at each other again, and Samuel watched both of them with the expression of a boy who understands something significant is happening and is trying to determine what. "Samuel," Eleanor said, "go find Daniel and tell him his grandmother is here." He was gone before she finished the sentence. The first hour was the hardest. Margaret was not cruel. Eleanor had prepared herself for cruelty and found instead something more difficult: precision. Catherine's mother asked questions the way a lawyer asks questions, each one building on the last. Each one designed not to gather information, but to test the consistency of what had already been said. She asked about Eleanor's family, her teaching history, the school board's decision, how she had come to be on the road in the storm. She asked about the boys' schedules, what Eleanor cooked, how the house was managed. She asked with careful indirection about the sleeping arrangements and accepted Eleanor's direct answer without visible reaction. Thomas sat at the end of the table during most of this and said very little, which Eleanor understood was not indifference, but a deliberate choice. He was letting her stand on her own, which was either trust or a test, and she had decided to treat it as the former. The question that changed the tone came in the second hour. Margaret had been looking at the shelf in the front room. She had asked to see the house, and Eleanor had shown her everything, including Catherine's Bible on the shelf and the rocking chair by the window. And she had run her hand along the Bible's spine without opening it, and then she had said without turning around, "You didn't move anything." "No," Eleanor said. "Thomas told you what to leave." "He told me about the rocking chair and the Bible," Eleanor said. "The rest I figured out myself." Margaret turned. "How?" "Because Daniel told me which chair was his mother's the first morning I was here," Eleanor said. "And I paid attention to what else he moved around carefully." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "He told you that himself?" "He didn't mean to. He said it to make a point, and I received the point and we moved on." "And you just moved to a different chair." "It cost me nothing," Eleanor said, "and it meant something to him. That's not a hard calculation." Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, not warmer exactly, but less constructed, more direct. "My daughter would have done exactly that," she said. "She had that same, she saw what things cost people, and she adjusted without making a production of it." Eleanor said nothing. "It's a specific quality," Margaret said. "Not common." She looked at the rocking chair. "She'd have been 33 next month." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "Thomas told me." Margaret looked at her sharply. "He talked to you about her birthday." "He talked to me about her," Eleanor said. "When I asked him to, I needed to understand what I was navigating." "What did he tell you?" "That she was funny and difficult, and rearranged the furniture when she felt trapped." A pause. "That she was the favorite." The breath that came out of Margaret Hollis was very quiet, but Eleanor heard it, the specific exhale of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has just briefly been allowed to set it down. "She rearranged my furniture too," Margaret said. "Every time she visited, I used to pretend to be annoyed." She stopped. "I would give every piece of furniture I owned to have her come in and move it one more time." Eleanor gave her a moment with that. Then she said, "Mrs. Hollis, I am not going to replace her. I know that, and I'm not trying to, and anyone who tells you otherwise is misreading what's happening here. What's happening is that two boys needed someone consistent, and their father needed someone honest, and I needed a home. And we are all of us doing our best with an imperfect situation." She paused. "But I want you to know the evidence of who she was is in those boys every single day. Daniel is careful and precise and thinks about what things cost people before he speaks. Samuel trusts completely and loves without reservation. Those are not accidents. Those came from someone." Margaret Hollis looked at her across Catherine's front room for a long moment. Her eyes were very bright. She didn't allow anything to fall. She was, Eleanor thought, exactly as strong as her daughter would have had to have been to produce Daniel's particular brand of dignity. "All right," Margaret said. "Show me what they're learning." Daniel came downstairs and stopped dead in the hallway when he saw his grandmother. For a moment, he stood there, 8 years old, and trying to be careful and completely failing at it, because she was his grandmother, and she had Catherine's eyes, and she was real and present in a way that letters were not, and the careful management he'd applied to himself for 6 weeks dropped entirely away. She crossed to him in 4 steps and put her arms around him and held on. And Daniel, who had not cried in front of anyone since the funeral, made a sound very quietly into her shoulder that was small and specific and completely broke the careful shell he'd been building and rebuilding for 14 months. Thomas was in the kitchen doorway. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at his son with an expression that was entirely undefended, for once raw and real and full of something that had nowhere to go. She walked past him to the kitchen. She put more water on for coffee. She gave them the room. After a moment, Thomas followed her into the kitchen. He stood at the counter with his back to her, looking out the window. "He hasn't done that," Thomas said. "Since?" "I know," Eleanor said. "I tried," he said. "I tried to. I didn't know how to." "You can't always be the one," she said. Not a criticism. Just a fact delivered as gently as she could make it. Sometimes it has to be someone who isn't carrying the same weight. Someone who can hold it without it costing them the same thing. Thomas turned. His face was more open than she had ever seen it. Not completely open, not Thomas's version of completely open, but further than before. Further than she'd thought he could get in one day. "Is that why you wrote to her yourself?" he said. "Instead of through me." "Partly," she said. "Also because she deserved to form her own opinion." "And has she?" he said. "Formed one?" "Ask her," Eleanor said. "She's not difficult to read if you're paying attention." Thomas looked toward the front room where Margaret's voice was low and steady, and Daniel's was next to it, the two of them talking the way people talk when they've been missing each other and have finally found their way back into range. "She doesn't give approval easily," Thomas said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "She doesn't." She handed him coffee. "Neither do you." He took the coffee. He looked at her over the rim. "She's going to want to talk to you alone," he said. "Tonight, probably, after the boys are in bed." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm not worried about it." "You should be," he said, without any particular alarm. "She's going to ask you things I haven't asked." "Such as?" He was quiet for a moment. "Such as what you actually want," he said. "From this, from..." He stopped. "She's going to ask what this is to you, not what the arrangement is. What it is." Eleanor held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table. "What would you want me to say?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not assessment, not recalibration. Something more direct than both of those. Something that had been working its way to the surface for 6 weeks and was almost there. "The truth," he said, "whatever that is." She held his gaze. "All right," she said. Sloan came back that same week. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He went to Miles City and filed a complaint with the county land office, alleging that the Caldwell Ranch's east pasture fence was encroaching on public grazing land, which was false, and he did it while Thomas was at the ranch with no easy way to respond. And Eleanor found out about it through Jake, who heard from the hand who'd made the supply run to town. She told Thomas that evening. He didn't react the way she'd expected. Not with anger, not with the flat, contained fury he'd shown when Sloan was in the yard. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment, and when he looked up, there was something very tired in his face. "He's escalating," Thomas said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "The complaint is false, but it'll take time to disprove. Time and money." He paused. "Time and money I'd be spending instead of fighting Price's rate adjustment." He looked at her. "It's coordinated, Sloan and Price." "I think so too," she said. "The timing is too precise. Carver files the challenge against Price's adjustment, and 3 days later, Sloan makes a move that forces you to split your resources." She sat down across from him. "They want you stretched thin, distracted, close enough to the edge that selling feels like relief." Thomas's jaw worked. "I'm not selling." "I know you're not," she said. "But we need to tell Carver about the complaint immediately. If he can file the challenge against Price before you have to formally respond to the land office complaint, we control the sequence. Price on defense first, Sloan's complaint second, rather than the other way around." Thomas looked at her. "You've already mapped this out." "I've been thinking about it since Jake told me," she said. "I've also been thinking about who else in this county has been on the receiving end of Price's adjustment provisions. You said Carver mentioned 3 other ranchers with similar notes." "He did." "Have any of them been approached by Sloan?" Thomas was still. "I don't know." "Find out," she said. "Because if Sloan has approached 2 or 3 of the same ranches that have notes with Price, that's not a pattern. That's a system. And a system can be argued in front of a territorial judge in a way that individual complaints can't." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "You want to build a collective case. I want Carver to build it," she said. "I want you to give him the names and the permission to reach out. If even one of those other ranchers will let Carver add their situation to the filing, the argument shifts from a dispute about one clause in one note to a documented pattern of coordinated fraud." "That's a serious allegation," he said. "It's a serious situation," she said. He was quiet again. She waited. She had learned to wait, for Thomas had learned that he processed things internally with a thoroughness that looked like silence, but was actually a great deal of work. "Margaret told me something last night," he said finally. Eleanor waited. "She said Catherine would have done exactly this, mapped it out, figured the sequence." He paused. "She said it wasn't a criticism." Something moved in Eleanor's chest. She kept her face steady. "What did you say?" "I said I knew." His voice was very quiet. "I said I had noticed." The fire crackled. Outside, the night was cold and vast and full of stars. "Write to Carver tonight," Eleanor said. "Tell him about the land office complaint. Tell him to reach out to the other ranchers." "I'll ride to the telegraph office at first light," Thomas said. "Faster than post." She nodded. She stood. She was almost to the door when he said her name. She stopped. "Eleanor?" She turned. He was still at the table, both hands flat on the wood, looking at her with that expression she had no name for yet. "Margaret asked me what this is," he said. "This arrangement. What it actually is." Her heart was very still. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't have the right word for it yet," he said. "But I told her it was real." A pause. "She said that was the most honest thing I'd said to her since the funeral." Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen. "Go to bed," she said. "You have to be up before dawn." "Eleanor." "Thomas." She said it firmly, not unkindly. "I heard what you said. I'm keeping it. But we have a fight to win first, and I need you functional tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then something in his face settled, not closed, but settled the way something settles when it's found its footing. "All right," he said. She went to her room. She lay in the dark and thought real. He had told Margaret it was real. She thought about 6 weeks of breakfasts and arithmetic and ledgers and fence line riders and legal clauses and library books left on tables and a boy who finally cried on his grandmother's shoulder and a man who stopped at his son's door every night just to be sure. She thought, yes, that's the right word, real. She didn't assign it anything else yet. Real was enough. Margaret left 4 days later, not because the situation had resolved, but because her business in Missouri would not wait indefinitely. But before she left, she came to Eleanor's room in the morning before the boys were up and knocked. Eleanor opened the door. Margaret stood in the hallway in her traveling coat, her trunk already moved to the front door, her face composed in the careful way it was always composed. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," Eleanor said. "I came here to decide whether to trust you," Margaret said. "I don't make that decision quickly, and I don't make it easily, and I want you to understand that it is not a small thing when I say that I've made it." Eleanor was very still. "I trust you with them," Margaret said. "With all 3 of them. And that is everything I have left. Do you understand me? Those 3 people are everything I have left of my daughter, and I am putting that in your hands. And I need you to know that I see what you're doing here. And I think she would have liked you very much." Eleanor's throat closed. She did not cry. She took a breath, a slow one, and held Margaret's gaze. "I will take care of them," she said. "I promise you that." Margaret nodded once firmly. Finally, the nod of a woman who has completed a decision and will not revisit it. "Write to me," Margaret said. "About all of them. Not just the boys. All 3. "I will," Eleanor said. Margaret turned and walked back down the hall. At the top of the stairs, she stopped. "Miss Whitmore," she said without turning. "Yes?" "He doesn't know how to say it," she said. "He never has. Catherine used to say that loving Thomas was like reading a book with half the words missing. You had to figure out the meaning from what was on the page." A pause. "She was very good at it. So are you, I think." Then she went downstairs, and Eleanor heard her say goodbye to the boys, and heard Thomas carry her trunk to the stage and heard the wheels on the frozen road going east. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, a book with half the words missing. She thought about the 10 steps across the yard. She thought about, "We have the document." She thought about the lamp he left burning when he knew she was working late. She thought about the way he watched his sons when he thought no one was watching him. She thought, "I have been reading that book for 6 weeks. She thought, "I know where most of the missing words are." Carver's response came fast. The telegraph had made the difference, the immediacy of it cutting through the weeks of postal delay. He had reached out to 2 of the 3 other ranchers. One had declined, afraid of Price's influence in the county. But the other, a man named Harris, who ran a cattle operation 20 miles north and had been watching his margins shrink for 2 years, said yes. 2 cases, same provision, same mechanism, same hands behind it. Carver filed both challenges in the territorial court on the same day, with a supporting brief that documented the pattern across both notes. The land office complaint from Sloan was answered within the week with a survey commissioned by Carver that demolished the encroachment claim with enough specificity that the land office closed the matter without a hearing. Thomas came home from the telegraph office on the day Carver's filing confirmation arrived and put the telegram on the kitchen table in front of Eleanor. She read it. She read it again. "He thinks Price will settle within 30 days, she said. "Both cases together." "That's what he thinks," Thomas said. "If he settles both, the pattern is documented even without a court ruling," she said. "That limits what he can do to any other ranchers in the county." "Yes?" Thomas sat down. He looked at the telegram. "You did this," he said. "Carver did this," she said. "And Harris, And you for being willing to send the letter in the first place." "You found the clause," he said. "In 30 minutes with a document I'd had for 3 years." She set the telegram down. "Does it matter who found it?" "To me it does," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same expression from the kitchen the night before Margaret left, the one that was almost all the way there, almost at the surface, pressing against the careful control he had maintained for as long as he'd known how. Samuel ran in from outside, with his coat half off and a completely illegible expression of emergency on his face. "There's a calf," he announced. "It's stuck, and Jake needs you, and it's stuck, really stuck, Papa, come." Thomas stood. He looked at Eleanor for one more moment, just a moment, the look of a man who has been interrupted at the exact wrong time and knows it, and then he went following Samuel out the back at a pace that was almost a run. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table. She picked up the telegram and read it a third time. She thought about Price settling, about Sloan losing his leverage, about the East pasture 20 acres of the best grazing land in the valley, staying exactly where it had always been. She thought about 31 cents in a carpet bag and a broken future walking toward a light in a blizzard. She thought, "I came here to survive the night." She thought, "I am going to stay for the rest of my life," not because the arrangement required it. Not because she had nowhere else to go that was 6 weeks ago, and she could go somewhere else. Now she had enough standing to rebuild. Carver had already told Thomas her work on the legal documents was worth a professional reference. She was going to stay because the telegram on the kitchen table, and the calf that was stuck, and Daniel's book on the kitchen shelf, and the step you had to skip on the stairs, and the lamp Thomas left burning. This was not survival anymore. This was home. She had not planned it. She had not chosen it exactly. It had simply become true while she was paying attention to other things, the way the most important things always became true quietly, and without announcement, and you looked up one day and found them already in place. She folded the telegram carefully and put it with the other documents she kept in the drawer, the legal correspondence, the household accounts, the letter from Margaret, the copy of Daniel's note to his grandmother. She stood up and started on supper. An hour later, Thomas came back from the barn, Samuel behind him covered in something she decided not to examine closely, and he stood in the doorway and said, "Calf is fine," with the flat, slightly exhausted satisfaction of a man who has resolved an emergency. "I assumed," she said. "Wash your hands, both of you." Samuel looked at his hands as if noticing their condition for the first time. "Oh," he said. "Both of you," she said again. Thomas looked at her from the doorway. One corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, not quite, but the closest thing to one she'd seen from him without the mediation of his children. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Eleanor turned back to the stove. She was smiling where no one could see it. Outside, the Montana sky was going dark in the east and blazing in the west the way it did when the day had been good and clear, and the cold was honest rather than mean. Inside the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and somewhere upstairs Daniel was reading Dumas, and somewhere outside Jake was checking the fence line, the way he checked it every evening, steady and reliable as the earth under the grass. And Thomas Caldwell was at the kitchen sink washing his hands, and Eleanor Whitmore was at the stove making supper, and neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The something that had no name was still growing quietly, steadily in every unspoken thing between them, in the telegram in the drawer, and the calf that was fine, and the missing words she'd learned to read. It would have a name soon enough. For now there was supper, and supper was enough. Price settled on the 23rd day. Carver sent the telegram to Thomas directly, but it was Eleanor who received it, because Thomas was out on the south fence line, and Jake had taken the rider to find him. And Eleanor was the one standing in the kitchen when the boy from the telegraph office knocked on the door and held out the envelope with the particular importance of someone delivering significant news. She read it standing in the doorway. Price had agreed to return every overpayment from the past 14 months, to revert the interest rate to its original terms for the remaining life of the note, and the part that made Eleanor read the sentence twice, to forgive the final 4 months of principal as part of the settlement agreement, which Carver had apparently negotiated in the last hour before Price's lawyer had intended to counter with something much smaller. She folded the telegram. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and pressed both hands flat on the wood and took a breath that was longer than she meant it to be. It was over. Not all of it. Sloane was still out there, and men like Sloane didn't stop because one mechanism failed. They looked for another angle. But the financial pressure that had been building for 14 months, the inflated rate that had been quietly draining this ranch toward a threshold Sloane could exploit, was gone. The east pasture was secure. The numbers changed entirely. She heard Thomas come in the back door while she was starting lunch. She didn't turn around. She heard him stop the particular stillness of a man who has entered a room and read something in it before anyone spoke. "What happened?" he said. She took the telegram from her apron and held it out without turning. She heard him cross the kitchen. She heard the sound of him taking it. She heard silence while he read it. Then she heard him set it on the counter beside her. She turned. He was standing very close, closer than he usually stood, because the kitchen was not large, and he had come directly to where she was. His face was doing the thing it did when something large was happening inside it, and he was deciding how much to show. He was showing more than usual. "Carver got the 4 months forgiven," she said. "I see that," he said. "That was the part I didn't expect," she said. "I thought he'd hold that in reserve." "He's a good lawyer," Thomas said. He was not looking at the telegram. He was looking at her. "Yes," she said. "Eleanor." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for the past 2 weeks, not as a way to start a sentence, but as the sentence itself, with everything the missing words would have said, compressed into the 2 syllables of her name. "I know," she said quietly. "I haven't said it," he said. "I know that too. I need to say it," he said. "Not because the arrangement requires it. Not because of the settlement or the pasture or any of that." He stopped. The jaw worked once. "Because it's true, and I've been carrying it around for 6 weeks, and I'm tired of carrying things alone." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "I want this to be real," he said. "Not the arrangement, not the contract. I want you to be here because you want to be here, because this is where you want to be. Not because you had 31 cents and a broken future, and I had a door and a practical solution." He paused. "I want you to choose it. Knowing everything. The ranch, the fight with Sloane that isn't finished. My boys, my—" He stopped. "Me," he said. "Knowing me." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Eleanor looked at Thomas Caldwell, at the weathered face, and the dark eyes, and the careful hands that had been holding everything together for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like not to hold things alone. She looked at the man who stopped at his son's door every night and left the lamp burning and said, "We have the document," like it was the most natural thing in the world to include her. "I know you," she said. "I've been reading you for 6 weeks." "And," he said. "And I'm still here," she said. "Thomas, I am still here." Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way ice breaks in the first real thaw of spring, fracture by fracture, the rigid surface giving way to something that had been moving underneath all along. He reached out and took her hand, not romantically, not a sweep or a declaration. Just his hand closing around hers on the counter, firm and real, and certain the way Thomas Caldwell did everything. With full commitment and no performance, she turned her hand over and held his back. They stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding on, and neither of them said anything, because they had both spent their lives learning that the truest things didn't need many words. Then Samuel ran in from outside and announced that Daniel had dared him to climb the big fence post, and he'd done it, and Daniel said it didn't count, because he'd used the rail as a step. And was this cheating? Eleanor? Was it cheating because he felt like it wasn't cheating? But Daniel Thomas let go of her hand. Eleanor turned to Samuel with the full gravity the situation required. "It depends," she said, "on whether the terms of the dare specified how you got to the top, or only that you reached it." Samuel's face went through several expressions rapidly. "It only said, 'Get to the top,'" he said with dawning triumph. "Then it counts," she said. Samuel turned and ran back outside to deliver this verdict at full volume. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Thomas. "Contractual interpretation," she said. "I see you're consistent," he said. "Always," she said, and turned back to lunch. The letter from Gerald Holt arrived the following week. It came addressed to Thomas, which was the first thing wrong with it, and it was written on school board stationery, which was the second, and it said in the measured language of a man who has decided to execute something, and is clothing it in procedure, that the board had received information suggesting that Miss Eleanor Whitmore, formerly of the Harmons Creek School, was currently residing at Caldwell Ranch in circumstances that the board considered inconsistent with the moral standards required of anyone affiliated with the territory's educational institutions, and that they were therefore formally requesting that Thomas Caldwell confirm or deny the nature of the arrangement, as the board had a responsibility to ensure that children in the territory were not exposed to. Thomas stopped reading it aloud at that point. Eleanor, who was sitting across the table from him, said, "Finish it." "It gets worse," he said. "Finish it," she said again. He finished it. The board had a responsibility to ensure that children in the territory were not exposed to arrangements that violated community moral standards, and furthermore, the board would be discussing at its next meeting whether the Caldwell children should be permitted to continue their current educational arrangements given the nature of the household. Eleanor sat very still when he finished. Thomas put the letter down. He was watching her with the focused attention of a man waiting to see which direction something is going to go, ready to move the moment he knows. "He's threatening the boys," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "He can't touch me directly anymore. I don't work for him. I'm not employed by any institution he controls. So he's threatening the boys." "Yes," Thomas said. "Can he do anything to them, legally?" "The boys are educated at home," Thomas said. "The territory doesn't require attendance at a formal school. He can make noise, but he can't compel anything." "Then this is a letter designed to frighten you into asking me to leave," she said. "He doesn't have actual authority. He has the threat of social pressure and the implication that there's more coming." "That's my reading," Thomas said. Eleanor looked at the letter on the table. She thought about Gerald Holt's round, satisfied face the day he told her that children didn't need to think beyond what their futures would allow. She thought about 3 years of careful, deliberate teaching, dismantled by a woman's complaint about a library book. She thought about Peter Grady reading until midnight and his father laughing about it, and Holt getting to Martha Grady before Frank could say anything useful. She thought about the fact that this was the same mechanism, the same threat dressed in different clothes. Comply or be damaged. Be invisible or be made an example. She had spent 3 years trying to be small enough to survive within Holt's system. She was done being small. "I want to write back," she said. Thomas looked at her. "To the board." "To the board," she said. "Not to Holt directly. To the board as a body. I want Carver to look at it first. I want to be sure about the legal ground, but I want to respond formally and on the record, and I want it to be very clear that this household is not afraid of Gerald Holt." "If you do that, he escalates," Thomas said. "He was always going to escalate," she said. "Men like Holt don't stop because you stay quiet. They stop when staying quiet stops working." She looked at Thomas. "You know that. It's the same principle as Price." Thomas was very still for a moment. "You'd be making yourself a target," he said. "Formally, publicly. Anyone in the territory who reads that letter is going to have an opinion about you." "People already have opinions about me," she said. "I've been living at your ranch for 7 weeks as your arranged wife. Opinion has been formed. The question is whether I respond to Holt's version of it or offer my own." Thomas picked up the letter and looked at it for a moment. "What do you want to say?" "That I am a qualified teacher who was dismissed for doing my job," she said, "and that the board's attempt to extend its authority over a private household has no legal basis, and that if the board wishes to discuss the educational standards being applied to the Caldwell children, they are welcome to send an inspector to observe, because I have no concern whatsoever about what they would find." She paused. "And that if Gerald Holt uses the board's letterhead for personal retaliation one more time, I'll be asking Carver to examine the board's financial records for the past 5 years. Thomas looked at her. She looked back at him. You don't actually have grounds for that last part, he said. Not yet, she said. But he doesn't know what I know and don't know. And if there's anything in those records worth finding, and I have reason to believe there might be, the implication is enough to make him careful. Thomas set the letter down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. Write the letter, he said. I'll take it to Carver tomorrow. I'll have it ready tonight, she said. He nodded. He picked up the letter and folded it and set it aside. Eleanor. Yes. If this goes badly. If it goes badly, I deal with what comes, she said. That's what I've always done. We deal with what comes, he said. Flat. Certain. The way he said things that weren't negotiable. She looked at him across the table and felt the word "we" settle into the room like something solid. Yes, she said. We. Charles. She wrote the letter that night 4 drafts before she was satisfied, each one sharper than the last, each one more precisely targeted. Carver approved it with 2 small changes, both of which made it better. It went out under both her name and Thomas's, which had been Thomas's addition without discussion, arriving on the table before she'd finished sealing the envelope. You don't have to sign it, she'd said. I know, he said, and signed it. Holt's response arrived 10 days later. It was 3 lines far shorter than his first letter. The brevity of a man who has decided to retreat and is trying to do it without looking like retreat. The board had reviewed the matter. The matter was considered closed. The board wished the Caldwell family well. Eleanor read it twice. She put it in the drawer with the other documents. She did not say "I told you so." She didn't need to. Thomas had read it first, and when he handed it to her, his face had that particular quality of a man who has watched something he was worried about turn out exactly as the person next to him said it would, and is experiencing that as both relief and something that was adjacent to pride, though he would not have called it that. Closed, he said. Closed, she agreed. He'll find another angle eventually, Thomas said. Probably, she said. But not today. Not today, he agreed. Jake, who had been leaning in the doorway and had read the letter over Thomas's shoulder, without apology, said, If you ever want to go back to teaching school proper, Miss Eleanor, I expect you could have your pick of positions after this. Eleanor looked at him. I'm exactly where I want to be teaching, she said. Jake looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Jake. Some communication passed between them that was entirely male and entirely wordless, and which Eleanor chose not to examine. Right, Jake said, and went back outside. Daniel came to her 3 days later with something in his hand. He held it out without preamble, the way he did everything now, with a directness that had been emerging steadily over 7 weeks, the careful watchfulness not gone, but transformed into something more like precision. He held out a folded piece of paper. She took it. She opened it. It was a letter. To the school board of Harmon's Creek. In Daniel's handwriting, which had improved significantly, and which she recognized because she had been watching it improve line by line through his correspondence with Margaret and his written arithmetic, and the composition exercises she had started giving him 2 weeks ago. She read it. It was 7 sentences long. It said that Daniel Caldwell, age 8, had been learning at home under the instruction of Eleanor Whitmore for the past 7 weeks. It said that in 7 weeks he had advanced further than in the prior 2 years of formal schooling at Harmon's Creek. It said that the board's suggestion that Miss Whitmore's instruction was in any way deficient was incorrect, and that Daniel knew this from direct experience. It said that he had discussed this with his father and had his father's permission to send this letter. It said that he hoped the board would consider what he had written as he had been taught, that evidence was the basis of any honest conclusion. The last sentence said, My mother taught me that some fights are worth having. I think this is one of them. Eleanor sat very still. She could feel Daniel watching her from across the table, alert, careful, reading her the way she had been reading his father, looking for the response beneath the response. "Did your father really give you permission?" she asked. "I asked him last night," Daniel said. "He read it and said yes. He didn't change anything. He suggested I move the part about evidence to the end," Daniel said. "He said it was the strongest line, and strongest lines go last." Eleanor looked at the letter again. The evidence sentence was second to last. The sentence about his mother was last. "He was almost right," she said. Daniel looked at the letter. "Which is the strongest line?" "The last one," she said. "The one about your mother." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure about that one," he said. It felt... He stopped working for the word. "Personal," he said. "For a formal letter." "The most effective arguments are always personal," she said. "Not emotional personal. There's a difference. Emotional means feeling without evidence. Personal means the evidence comes from your own life, and that's the most credible kind." She folded the letter carefully along its crease. "Can I send this?" He blinked. "You want to actually send it?" "It's a good letter, Daniel. It makes the argument better than mine did in some ways, because it makes it from where Holt can't attack from a child who has nothing to gain and is simply reporting what's true." She paused. "But it has to be your decision. This is your name on it. Once you send it, it's part of the record." He thought about this with the seriousness of an 8-year-old who has learned what it means for something to be part of the record. "Send it," he said. She sent it with the next post. Holt never replied to Daniel's letter. His silence was its own answer, and Eleanor chose to read it the way she read all silences, as information. He was done. Not because he had changed his mind about her, not because he had become a better man. Because the cost had exceeded what he was willing to pay. That was enough. She had never needed him to become better. She had only needed him to stop. The snow came again in February, but not the way it had come in December, not the blinding, annihilating kind that swallowed the world. This was steady and quiet, and the kind of cold that was honest about what it was, and the ranch was ready for it. Eleanor was ready for it. Samuel had started reading on his own, actual reading, not recitation, not memory. She had found him one morning sitting in the kitchen with the flour sack label, not because she had put it there, but because he had chosen it, sounding out the words, the way she had shown him, his lips moving slightly, his finger tracking. She had stood in the doorway for a long moment watching him, and had not said anything, because saying anything would have made him self-conscious, and the self-consciousness would have interrupted the moment, and the moment was too important to interrupt. She told Thomas that evening. He had been quiet for a moment in the particular way he went quiet, when something mattered more than he was going to let it show in his face. "How long before he's reading properly?" Thomas asked. "He already is," Eleanor said. "Reading properly means making meaning from marks on a page. He's doing that. The rest is just expanding the vocabulary." She paused. "He'll be reading David Copperfield by summer if he keeps at this pace." Thomas looked at her. "You're not serious." "I am entirely serious," she said. "He's 5 years old, and he's been in a household where reading happens at every surface. Children absorb what surrounds them." She paused. "He was always going to be a reader. He just needed to know it was for him, not just for school." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't know how to do that," he said. "Give them that environment. Catherine was the one who read to them. After she died, I read to Samuel sometimes, but it felt..." He stopped. "It felt like performing something that belonged to her," Eleanor said. "Yes," he said. "You can both be readers," she said. "It doesn't belong to anyone. It just needs to happen." She looked at him. "What did you read when you were young?" He looked slightly caught, the expression of a man who had not expected to be asked something personal, and is deciding how to handle it. "Cooper," he said finally. "The frontier novels. My father had them. I read them until they fell apart." "Then read them to the boys," she said. "Not as Catherine's thing, or as your thing." as yours. They want to know who their father is. That's one of the ways you show them." Thomas was very quiet for a long moment. "You do that," he said. "You show people who they are to themselves. You say the thing that—" He stopped, tried again. "You make people see themselves clearly, without making it painful." She looked at him. "Is that what you see?" she asked. "It's what I've watched you do," he said. "For 7 weeks. With the boys, with Margaret, with Jake." He paused. "With me." She held his gaze. "I see what's there," she said. "I'm just not afraid of it." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Eleanor," he said. And this time he didn't stop. This time he let the missing words arrive. "I love you," he said. Flat, direct, without decoration. The way Thomas Caldwell said everything true with full commitment and no performance, as if saying it simply was the only way to say it honestly. "I know the timing of it is. I know what the arrangement was supposed to be. I know I said separate lives." He paused. "I was wrong about what I could keep separate." The kitchen was completely still. Eleanor stood with this for a moment. She gave it the respect it deserved, this man who had been holding everything alone for 14 months, standing across a kitchen and saying I was wrong, because he had decided that being right about his own protection was worth less than being honest about what was real. "Thomas," she said, "you don't have to." "Thomas," she said again, firmly, kindly. "Be quiet for a moment." He went quiet. She walked around the table to where he was standing. She stopped in front of him. She looked at his face, all of it, the weathered skin and the dark eyes and the jaw that worked when things were large and the hands that were still at his sides, because he had said the thing and now he was waiting the way he always waited, with the full patience of a man who had learned that control was all you could actually keep. She took his face in her hands. He went very still. "I walked 4 miles through a blizzard because there was a light in your window," she said. "I shook your hand across a kitchen table and told you I would not perform a family. And then I did everything I could think of to make this family real." She paused. "I didn't do that because the arrangement required it. I did it because from the first morning when I sat in the wrong chair and you didn't make a thing of it, and Daniel told me which chair mattered, and you watched me move without saying a word from that morning, I knew what kind of man you were, and I chose this." She paused again. "I choose this. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because there is nowhere else I want to be." Something in Thomas Caldwell's face changed in a way she had never seen before. Not the careful fractional openings she'd been watching for 7 weeks. Not the measured acknowledgments and the indirect disclosures. Something complete. He put his arms around her and held on, and Eleanor held on back, and they stood in the kitchen with the snow coming down outside, and the fire steady behind them, and the whole particular weight of the past 7 weeks settling into something that felt finally entirely like what it was. Not an arrangement, not a contract, not a practical solution to 2 practical problems. Home. Samuel found them like that and announced that he was hungry, which broke the moment in the way only 5-year-olds can break moments completely without apology, with the absolute conviction that their hunger is the most important thing happening in any room. Thomas stepped back. Eleanor stepped back. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that was warm and real and slightly amused and entirely adult. "Make him a biscuit," Thomas said. "You make him a biscuit," Eleanor said. "You know where they are." Thomas looked at her. He looked at Samuel. He went to the biscuit tin. Samuel watched his father locate and produce a biscuit with the expression of a boy witnessing a minor miracle. "You know where the biscuits are," he said. "I live here," Thomas said. "You never get the biscuits," Samuel said. "Eleanor always gets them." "Eleanor is busy," Thomas said. Samuel looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the ceiling. Samuel looked back at his father. "Are you going to get biscuits now?" Samuel asked with enormous gravity. "From now on." "I might," Thomas said. Samuel processed this. "Okay," he said, and took his biscuit and went back outside. Thomas turned and looked at Eleanor. She was trying not to smile and not succeeding. "Don't," he said. "I'm not doing anything," she said. "You're doing something," he said. "I'm standing here being busy," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. That not-quite smile she had been cataloging for 7 weeks, the one that arrived without permission and was more genuine than any manufactured expression because it wasn't managed, it just happened. "Eleanor," he said. "Thomas," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not the arrangement, not the contract. Actually marry me." She looked at him. "You already asked me that," she said. 7 weeks ago. "I asked you for a practical arrangement," he said. "I'm asking for something else now." She tilted her head slightly. "What's the difference in practical terms?" "In practical terms, none," he said. "The house is the same. The boys are the same. The ranch is the same." "Then, what's different?" she said. "I am," he said, simply, without qualification. "I am different. I was asking you to fill a function. Now I'm asking you to—" He stopped. "Worked for it." "Stay," he said. "Just stay. Because you want to. Because this is yours as much as it's mine." She looked at this man, this careful, honest, lonely, capable man, who had finally run out of room to hold everything alone and had the courage to say so. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Thomas." He exhaled a long, slow breath, the kind that carries something with it. He crossed the kitchen to her in the same 10 steps he'd crossed the yard that morning when Sloane was there, the same direct, committed movement. And this time, he kissed her once firm and real, and without any performance, the way Thomas Caldwell did everything true. And Eleanor kissed him back. Daniel found out at supper. They told the boys together. Thomas matter-of-fact, Eleanor watching both faces. Samuel's response was immediate. He said good, with the satisfied confidence of a boy who had decided this was the correct outcome weeks ago and was pleased to have it confirmed. He then asked if there would be cake, because in his understanding weddings involved cake. And when Thomas confirmed there would be cake, Samuel returned to his supper with complete contentment. Daniel was quiet for longer. He looked at the table. He looked at his father. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the table again. Then he said to Eleanor, "This is different from the arrangement." "Yes," she said. "It is." "You want to be here?" he said. Not a question. He was checking something, confirming it. "Yes, Daniel," she said. "I want to be here." He looked at her for a long moment with those careful eyes that had been watching her for 7 weeks, cataloging everything, reserving judgment, waiting for the evidence to be sufficient. The evidence was sufficient. "Okay," he said, and went back to his supper. Thomas caught Eleanor's eye over the boys' heads. She saw everything in his face that he had always kept behind it. Gratitude, love, the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something in the dark for a very long time and has finally walked into the light. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Eat your supper, Thomas." He ate his supper. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church at Jefferson Crossing, with Jake as witness, and the minister's wife as the second. And Margaret Hollis had come from Missouri, because Eleanor had written to her the same day Thomas proposed, and Margaret had written back in 48 hours a new record with a letter that said, "Only I will be there. Save me a seat near the front." She was there. She sat near the front. She did not cry in the way of women who have made a decision about crying in public and hold to it with the same discipline they bring to everything else. But when Eleanor came down the small aisle in a dress that had been Catherine's, offered by Margaret herself, brought in the trunk from Missouri, altered by Eleanor's own hands to fit, Margaret pressed her lips together once very briefly, and Eleanor saw it and understood what it meant. It meant she would have been glad. It meant you are not replacing her. You are continuing something she started. It meant welcome. The service was short. Thomas said his vows with the same directness he brought to every true thing, looking at her, meaning every word, not performing any of it. Eleanor said hers, looking at him. When it was done, Jake shook Thomas's hand, and then thought better of it and embraced him instead, which Thomas accepted with the slight stiffness of a man who has not been embraced often and is not entirely sure of the protocol but is willing to learn. Samuel held Eleanor's hand all the way through the small reception that the minister's wife had organized with remarkable efficiency, cakes as promised and coffee and cider, and announced to every adult who would listen that his papa could now find the biscuits himself. Daniel stood next to his grandmother for most of the afternoon, and Eleanor watched them from across the room. Two careful people, both of them precise and watchful, both of them trying not to show how much they were feeling. She watched Daniel say something to Margaret that made the older woman put her hand over his, very briefly, just for a moment, and then look away. And Daniel look away too, both of them maintaining their dignity with absolute seriousness. She thought, he's so much like her. Both of them, Margaret and Daniel. Catherine's precision living on in both directions, backward into the woman who had raised her and forward into the boy she had raised. She thought, she's not gone. She's all over this room. Thomas came to stand beside her. He followed her gaze to where Daniel and Margaret were standing. He told her something, Eleanor said. I know, Thomas said. What did he say? He told her Mama would have liked you, Thomas said quietly. Margaret told me on the way in. She said he came to her this morning and asked her if she thought it was true, and she told him yes, absolutely yes, and he said... Thomas stopped for a moment. He said then it was okay, that he'd been waiting to be sure. Eleanor was very still. 7 weeks of careful watching, 7 weeks of arithmetic and Dumas and letters to grandmothers, and the evidence was sufficient and okay. Did he know you told me? She asked. No, Thomas said. Don't tell him, she said. I wasn't planning to, he said. They stood side by side in the small room watching their family. The word felt entirely natural, now entirely accurate, and the cakes were good, and the coffee was hot, and Samuel was on his third piece of something, and Jake was telling Margaret a story that was making her fight a smile and losing. Thomas put his hand over Eleanor's where it rested at her side. She turned her hand over and held his. Thomas, she said. Eleanor, he said. We're going to be all right, she said. Yes, he said. We are. Not because the ranch was secure, though it was. Not because Holt had gone quiet, though he had. Not because the east pasture was safe, and the notes were settled, and Sloane had found easier targets in the north. All of that was true, and none of it was the reason. They were going to be all right because a woman had walked 4 miles through a blizzard toward a light in a window, and a man had opened the door, and 2 boys had watched carefully and decided to trust. And a grandmother had come from Missouri with a packed trunk and a dress in tissue paper, and a foreman who couldn't read letters had seen the shape of things clearly before any of them had named it. They were going to be all right because family was not a thing you were born into or fell into or arranged yourself into. It was a thing you built one honest day at a time with whoever had the courage to show up and stay. Eleanor Whitmore had shown up. Thomas Caldwell had opened the door. And neither of them was ever going to be alone in the dark again.